It began 3 days before my first public speaking engagement. I remember that afternoon vividly. I was standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing my speech, heart pounding in rhythm with the relentless ticking of the clock. My reflection stared back, a frightened version of me, and I suddenly hated that I was going to have to speak in front of a crowded room. Speaking was hard enough for me, but even thinking about being in front of a group turned my stomach into knots. As the anxiety clawed at me, I decided it was time to confront my fear head-on. I started researching ways to ease my anxiety, breathing techniques, visualization, even a pep talk with myself while looking in the mirror. But as the day approached, desperation set in. That night, I had a vivid dream that altered everything. In that dream, I stood on the stage. The audience loomed before me, shadowy and dark, watching with hungry eyes. Suddenly, they morphed into faceless, twisted creatures, mouths agape, waiting for me to fall flat on my face. I woke up in a panic, drenched in sweat. But what scared me the most was the laughter, the echo of their distorted giggles haunting me even upon waking. I tried reaching out to friends for reassurance, but I quickly realized they didn't understand the marrow deep terror that gripped me. The day before the speech, I walked past the auditorium where I would be speaking. Its doors were closed, but it loomed like a monstrous mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I decided to take a different route home, trying to forget the looming dread. That night, amidst sleeplessness and rising anxiety, I stumbled upon an online forum dedicated to overcoming fears and phobias. I began scrolling through posts, and that's when I found it, a thread titled, "Conquer Your Fears, A Personal Experience." The author claimed they had fought their fear in an unorthodox way. Intrigued, I read more about this peculiar approach. They described not just speaking, but embracing the fear. The thread detailed a ritual, reciting an invocation to the spirits of public speaking while standing in front of a mirror, holding a candle. I dismissed it as nonsense at first, but as my desperation grew, I realized I was at the end of my rope. So there I stood, candle flickering, invoking a bizarre chant that promised to rid me of my fear. I felt silly, but beneath that silliness lurked a sliver of hope. The candle burnt down, and for an instant, an eerie quiet enveloped me. I closed my eyes and visualized standing confidently on stage. Something shifted within me, a whisper of power, the echo of courage. It was fleeting, but it flickered faintly in my heart. Then, the day of the speech arrived, and I donned a facade of confidence despite the storm raging inside me. My hands trembled, sweat beading on my forehead, but I reminded myself I had done my ritual. I made my way to the auditorium, the doors swinging open with an unnerving creak. I stepped inside and faced the gathering audience, a murmur filling the space with an electrifying tension. My legs felt like jelly, and my throat closed up, but I took a deep breath and began speaking. I started with a shaky introduction, words spilling out in a rush, but I pushed through. And as I continued, something remarkable happened. The laughter in my dream echoed less and less, replaced by a strange sense of connection to the people before me. I locked eyes with an older woman in the front row, and she smiled warmly, a soft anchor in my sea of fear. My anxiety began to dissipate, and I found myself speaking with clarity, conviction rising within me like a tide. I paced the stage, gesturing wildly, losing myself in the rhythm of my own voice, and it was exhilarating. I finished with applause ringing in my ears, but suddenly, a feeling crashed over me, one I hadn't anticipated. The moment felt surreal, as if time itself had warped. Before I exited the stage, I saw a figure in the back of the auditorium, a dark shape watching intently, its features obscured but somehow menacing. My heart dropped. I had forgotten about the online ritual. Had I stirred something by calling forth that energy? I shook off the thought, attributing it to residual adrenaline. However, I couldn't deny an unsettling sense of dread creeping in. As I gathered my things to leave, I overheard hushed whispers. My heart raced, strangers were talking about me. At first, I basked in the soothing warmth of their words, praising my courage and charisma. Yet there was an undertone, a peculiar edge to their comments that put me on high alert. "Did you see that?" one said, his voice anxious. He was speaking to something, like he wasn't alone. My blood ran cold. They saw what I had summoned. Had I drawn attention to the darkness lurking just outside the glow of my newfound confidence? That evening, as I lay in bed, I could feel the prickling terror inching back under my skin, lurking just at the edges of my mind. The applause morphed into taunting giggles again, the shadowy figure surfacing in my thoughts, a reminder of what I had unleashed. Sleep eluded me. Was my fear truly conquered, or simply transformed, muted in the face of something far darker? Days passed, and I tried to suppress the mounting anxiety while feigning calmness. I even attended another event, hoping to reassure myself. But at every turn, I felt eyes on me, like invisible chains tethering me to that shadowy presence. The faint laughter echoed in crowded places, whispering my name with sinister glee. I couldn't shake off the understanding that there was a connection to the fear I had faced. It seemed to be feeding off my vulnerability. It was only days later that I dared to look back at that online forum, desperate for answers, but instead of relief, I was met with chilling posts warning against invoking spirits. Once they are called, one post read, their laughter becomes your curse. Panic gripped me as a chilling realization unfurled within. I had unwittingly summoned something sinister instead of overcoming my fear of public speaking. I searched frantically for ways to undo my actions, diving deeper into threads and whispering incantations for cleansing. But deep down, I knew I secretly reveled in the exhilaration my fear had once brought. Perhaps it was the thrill of being watched, of dancing on the edge of panic and connection. The duality of fear and empowerment began to rise, twisting inside me like a knife. Weeks turned into months, and I fought to reclaim my courage but could only feel the haunting laughter growing louder in my mind. I attended every public speaking event I could find, searching for ways to banish the shadow I had conjured. No matter how well I spoke, the shadow lingered, sometimes manifesting in mysterious nudges, reminders of its presence, office meetings turning into stifled laughter or casual conversations with friends transforming into surfaces of turmoil. Each laughter echoed the agony of my struggle, triumph twisted into trial. My journey had evolved from overcoming fear to confronting something darker. When I stood up to speak now, it was never just my voice that echoed through the crowd, it was the laughter of unseen watchers, enticing me down an even darker path. I could only wonder if I was meant to embrace that fear entirely, for once curiosity is breached, can it truly be conquered? Is fear merely another side of courage? All I know is the shadow gnaws at my sanity, leaving me vulnerable, dancing in the shadows of my being. The laughter never stops, and I wonder if I am just a player on a stage of their making, whispering my fears into the night. I'm still speaking, still sharing my journey. But unlike before, every word comes with a lingering dread, waiting for that final curtain call. The time I tried to help a friend but made it worse. It started as one of those situations where you think you're doing the right thing, only to realize too late that you've stepped into something far more complicated than you ever imagined. My friend Tyler had been going through a rough patch for months. His girlfriend of 5 years had broken up with him, his job was draining the life out of him, and he'd been retreating more and more into himself. I'd never seen him like that before. Tyler had always been the guy who cracked jokes at the worst possible moments, the guy who could walk into a room and instantly make everyone feel a little lighter. But now, he was like a shadow of himself, quieter, heavier somehow, and it worried me. I tried texting and calling him regularly, but his responses were always short, as if he didn't have the energy to pretend things were okay. I couldn't stand seeing him like that, so I decided to do something about it. Looking back, I probably should have just left it alone or at least asked him what he needed, but at the time, I thought I knew better. I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea, a surprise intervention of sorts. Not the serious, TV-style intervention, but more like a carefully orchestrated hangout where he'd be surrounded by his closest friends, the people who loved him most. I figured we could cheer him up, remind him that he wasn't alone, and maybe even help him laugh for the first time in weeks. I reached out to our mutual friends, Emily and Dave, and they were on board immediately. We planned everything down to the last detail. Dave would pick him up under the guise of grabbing a drink, Emily would handle snacks and drinks at her apartment, and I would gather a few more friends who hadn't seen Tyler in a while. We even decided to play his favorite card game and set up a playlist of all his favorite songs. It felt foolproof. The night of the surprise, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Emily's apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of popcorn and the sound of soft music playing in the background. We all waited in hushed anticipation for Tyler to arrive, and when he walked through the door with Dave, we all shouted, "Surprise!" He froze in the doorway, his face unreadable. At first, I thought he was just overwhelmed in a good way. After all, who wouldn't appreciate seeing their friends come together to lift their spirits? But then I saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders tensed, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Tyler didn't look happy or relieved. He looked cornered, like a caged animal. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "We just wanted to hang out, man," I said, trying to keep things light. "We thought it'd be fun to get everyone together, cheer you up a bit." His eyes darted around the room, landing on each of us in turn. "Cheer me up? Seriously?" The tension in the room was palpable. No one knew what to say. Tyler's expression darkened, and he shook his head. "You all think you know what I need? Did it ever occur to you to just ask me instead of ambushing me like this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He was right, we hadn't asked. We'd assumed we knew what was best for him, and now it was blowing up in our faces. Tyler turned to leave, but Dave stepped in front of the door, blocking his path. "Come on, man, don't be like that," Dave said, his voice pleading. "We're just trying to help." Tyler's voice rose, sharp and angry. "Help? You think this is helping? I didn't ask for this. I don't need a room full of people trying to fix me like I'm some kind of project." Emily, always the peacemaker, tried to defuse the situation. "Tyler, we're sorry. We didn't mean to make you feel like this. We just what?" he snapped, cutting her off. "Just wanted to feel good about yourselves for playing hero? Well, congratulations, you've done it. I feel worse than I did before I walked in here." And with that, he pushed past Dave and stormed out the door. The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew what to say. I felt a lump in my throat, a mix of guilt and regret weighing heavily on my chest. I had orchestrated this whole thing, convinced that I was doing the right thing, and now I had to face the fact that I'd only made things worse. I spent the rest of the night replaying the scene in my head, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. The answer was obvious, of course. I'd acted without thinking, without considering how Tyler might feel about all of this. I'd assumed that my idea of help would align with what he actually needed, and that assumption had backfired spectacularly. The next day, I texted Tyler to apologize. I didn't expect a response, and for a while, I didn't get one. But later that evening, my phone buzzed with a single message: "I know you meant well, but next time, just ask. I don't need grand gestures. I just need people to listen." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me realize how badly I'd misunderstood him. In the weeks that followed, I made a conscious effort to be there for Tyler in the way he needed, not the way I thought he needed. I stopped trying to fix him and started just being present, whether that meant sitting in silence during a movie or grabbing coffee and letting him talk about whatever was on his mind. It wasn't easy, old habits die hard, but slowly, I started to see glimpses of the Tyler I knew before. He began to laugh again, to crack those ridiculous jokes that always made me roll my eyes, and I knew he was on his way back to himself. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about friendship and empathy. Sometimes, the best way to help someone isn't to swoop in with a solution but to simply be there, to listen, to let them know they're not alone. I tried to force a happy ending, but in the end, it was Tyler who showed me what real support looks like. It's messy and imperfect, but it's honest, and that makes all the difference. When I learned to appreciate my parents' sacrifices, it was not through some heartwarming moment over a family dinner or a sappy television show. No, it was a dark, desperate time that forced me to confront the weight of their struggles and the extent of their love. I always thought I had a typical middle-class upbringing. I attended school, went to soccer practice, and spent Saturdays lazing around, playing video games while my parents bustled about with their daily routines. They worked hard, but I never really grasped the magnitude of their sacrifices. It was during my sophomore year of college, a time when the world finally started feeling big and overwhelming, that everything changed. I had just finished a particularly rough week filled with exams and an exhausting part-time job, and on that fateful Friday night, I decided to hit a local bar with my friends to blow off steam. That's when I received the call, the kind that throttles your insides like a vice. My mom's voice trembled on the other end, a mixture of fear and sadness rippling through her words. Dad had been in a car accident, they were taking him to the hospital, and I needed to come home. The drive back felt like a fever dream, hours stretching as I replayed memories of my dad, the way he threw me in the air when I was little, the stories he told each night before bed, how he taught me to ride a bike with nothing but patience and that unmistakable grin of his. I arrived at the hospital, heart racing, and I'll spare you the gruesome details, but we didn't know if he was going to make it. It was a blur of sterile rooms and waiting areas filled with anxious faces. I sat, pacing, my fingers digging into my skin, wondering how this could happen to such a good man. The doctors did everything they could, and after an agonizing 24 hours, they finally let us see him, bandaged, bruised, but alive. That night, as I sat in his hospital room, I tried to wrap my head around what had happened. It should have been a simple drive, but it was a reminder of how fragile life is, and I couldn't help but resent the universe a little for putting us in this situation. Days passed, and as he slowly recovered, we talked more. At first, it was about trivial things, and then, somehow, the conversation turned to sacrifices. Dad recounted stories from his own childhood, growing up in a poor neighborhood, working multiple jobs to pay for college, the struggles my grandparents faced as immigrants looking for a better life. Each tale seemed to tether me closer, connecting the dots between his past and the life I had inherited, a life infused with countless unseen sacrifices. I listened, and the weight of it all began to flood over me. I realized that every time he had insisted I should focus on my studies, it wasn't just parental nagging, it was his attempt to ensure that I wouldn't have to face the same struggles he did, that I might find a way to climb higher, beyond their sacrifices. The layers of their love, unpeeled one by one, revealed a depth I had often taken for granted. My parents had worked endless hours, seldom indulging, saving every dime for my education, worrying silently about bills while still managing to put a plate of food on the table and a smile on their faces. I saw their financial struggles in a different light, no longer just a matter of numbers but representative of their unwavering love for me. They fought through their own pain to nurture my growth, encouraging my dreams while silently burying their own disappointments. The more we talked, the more I began to see my own life as a tapestry woven with their sacrifices. A small harrowing incident happened one night, while I was at home caring for my dad during his recovery. Half asleep on the couch beside him, I was awoken by a sudden cough, only to witness him fumbling for his medication that he had clumsily dropped on the floor. I rushed to his aid, but as I kneeled, I caught a glimpse of his weary eyes. It dawned on me, every ache and pain he had was a product of years spent toiling for our family, yet here he was, determined to show up for me, even in his fragile state. In that moment, it was like a storm broke inside me. I gripped his hand tightly, this time not out of fear but to ground myself in the present, in the recognition of all he had sacrificed. The next weekend, after he was discharged, I returned to campus, but everything felt different. Instead of scrolling through social media or zoning out in classes, I was stirred by an urgency to reach out. I called my mom, thanking her for juggling work, the home, everything so beautifully, often while I was oblivious to how demanding it really was. I promised to come home more, to genuinely listen, to be present. I began volunteering in community service, realizing that there were countless families like mine, whose stories stayed buried beneath layers of daily struggles. I took those journeys home more frequently, sometimes just to sit in the kitchen with my parents as they cooked, savoring every laugh, every moment. We might not have much in terms of material wealth, but I arrived at a realization that our family was richer than most in love and resilience. Eventually, I returned to university, transformed. My grades improved, yes, but more importantly, I was less distracted by the trivialities of college life. I found new purpose in achieving my dreams, not just for myself but also for my parents, to honor the sacrifices they made. When I walked across the stage at graduation, I searched for them in the crowd, and instead of just acknowledging their efforts in a speech, I planned to take them on a trip, a promise I kept. Looking back, the accident was a stark moment that unveiled the complexities of love within sacrifice. A veil had been lifted, allowing me to appreciate everything my parents endured. It wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a rebirth of sorts, a realization that life is not about living for oneself, but about embracing the opportunities in every experience. Now, my parents are my beacon. They remind me that to appreciate truly means to understand the depths from which love arises, and now I live my life not just for myself but for them, always. I share this not just to recount that harrowing time but to inspire anyone who feels distant from their family. Listen, truly listen, you might discover the sacrifices, and the love, that bind you together are far greater than you ever imagined. How I found closure after a difficult breakup, my journey. It's funny how life can suddenly shift on its axis, how one moment you can be blissfully in love, and the next you're standing at the edge of a chasm, unsure if you'll ever be able to climb out. I used to believe that I understood heartbreak, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastation I felt after my breakup. My ex and I had been together for nearly 4 years, and though we weren't perfect, I genuinely believed we would make it through anything. That was until the day she sat me down and told me she wasn't happy anymore. I could see the pain in her eyes, but what hit hardest was the sense of finality in her voice. She told me that she had tried, but she just couldn't keep pretending. There was no dramatic fight, no major betrayal, it was simply an overwhelming feeling that something had died between us, something neither of us could revive. The days that followed felt like a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, surrounding myself with friends and family, pretending like I was fine. But I wasn't. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the thought that everything I had built with her, everything I had believed in, had just disappeared. I found myself constantly checking my phone, hoping for some sign, some message, that maybe we could fix things. But nothing came. Slowly, I realized that I had to let go. I had to accept that this chapter of my life was over, even though every fiber of my being screamed to hold on. One evening, a few weeks after the breakup, I decided to take a walk. The weather was cooler, the leaves just beginning to turn, and something about the stillness of the evening made me feel like I could think clearly for the first time in weeks. I wandered aimlessly for a while, my thoughts consumed with memories of her, the way she laughed, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. I missed her, and it hurt to know that those moments were gone. But as I walked, something unexpected happened. I found myself taking in the world around me in a way I hadn't in months. I watched a couple walking hand in hand, and instead of feeling a pang of jealousy, I felt a sense of peace. I could feel the weight of the loss starting to lift, just a little. The more I walked, the more I realized that life was still happening, and even though my relationship had ended, the world hadn't stopped turning. I didn't need to hold on to the past to keep moving forward. That night, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would focus on healing, on rediscovering who I was outside of the relationship. I wasn't going to rush the process, and I wasn't going to try to force closure. I knew it would come in its own time. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work and hobbies I had put on hold for far too long. I started running again, something I used to love but had stopped doing when we started dating. The physical exhaustion helped clear my mind, and, for the first time, I felt like I was reconnecting with myself. I also spent more time with my friends, really leaning on them when I needed support, and it was through their encouragement that I started to get out of my head. They made me laugh when I thought I would never smile again, and their constant reminders that I was worthy of love helped me rebuild my self-esteem. But even with all this progress, there were moments when the loneliness hit hard. There were nights when I'd lay in bed and wish things had turned out differently. But rather than spiraling into despair, I learned to sit with that pain. I let myself feel it, not to wallow in it, but to acknowledge that it was a part of my healing. I began to understand that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about completely erasing the pain, but learning to live with it, to find peace with the past. Then came the day I least expected it. I had been sitting at a coffee shop, lost in a book, when I heard a familiar voice. I looked up and saw her standing there. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She smiled awkwardly, and I could tell she was unsure whether she should approach me. I put down my book and nodded for her to come over. When she sat down, we exchanged a few pleasantries, but I could sense that there was something more to this meeting. She looked at me with a mixture of regret and sadness, and she admitted that she had been thinking about me a lot lately. She told me she hadn't expected the breakup to affect her as much as it had, but it had. She had spent the last few months reflecting on herself, on us, and she realized that she hadn't been fair to me, that she had been running away from the hard conversations instead of facing them. I listened quietly, not because I was still in love with her, but because I wanted to hear her words. I had spent so many months in my own head, imagining what she might be thinking or feeling, that hearing it from her, hearing her take responsibility for her part, gave me the closure I didn't even realize I needed. When she finished, there was a long pause. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to scream, to ask why she had waited so long to tell me these things. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and told her that I had been doing okay, that I was healing. I told her that I had learned a lot about myself, about what I wanted and needed in a relationship. I thanked her for being honest, but I also told her that I had come to terms with the fact that we weren't right for each other. That moment, sitting across from her in that coffee shop, was the final step in my healing process. I had let go. I didn't feel anger or bitterness, I simply felt peace. I realized that sometimes, closure doesn't come from the other person apologizing or making amends. Sometimes, closure is about accepting that things didn't work out the way you hoped and finding peace with that. I walked away from that conversation knowing that I was stronger than I had been when the breakup first happened. I had faced my pain head-on, and I had come out the other side. And as I walked down the street, I felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in months. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I knew I was going to be okay. I never thought my anxiety would lead me to such an unusual encounter, one that both terrified and transformed me. I used to dread public settings, crowded cafes, busy elevators, even the local grocery store. Just thinking about being around other people set my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. On that particular Thursday evening, I had just finished another grueling week at work, and my best friend, Mia, urged me to join her at an art exhibit downtown. "It'll be fun," she insisted, her excitement palpable over the phone. But all I could focus on was the idea of being surrounded by crowds, strangers brushing past me, and the constant chatter that would surely drown out my thoughts. For days, I tried to convince myself to say no. But eventually, after a combination of guilt and a desire to break out of my self-imposed isolation, I relented. "Fine, I'll go, but only for a little while," I reluctantly replied. As the time approached, I prepared myself, donning a comfortable sweater and my most grounding pair of sneakers. My palms were clammy, my stomach churned with unease as I stepped out of my front door, but I pushed through and hopped on the subway, hardly able to focus on anything besides the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. The neon lights and rushing sounds blurred into a surreal dreamscape until I found myself finally at the gallery doors, where Mia greeted me with a wide grin. I wished I could share her enthusiasm, but the way my heart was racing made me feel like a deer caught in headlights. The gallery was packed, an overwhelming sea of bodies moving from one exhibit to the next. I stood stiffly at the entrance, my breath quickening and my head spinning as I scanned the room. The walls adorned with vivid art pieces seemed to swirl in front of my eyes, and I struggled to focus on any one. I felt a tightness in my chest, the panic creeping in slowly. Mia grabbed my hand, and we made our way toward a large piece that resembled a chaotic explosion of color. "Isn't it beautiful?" she cooed. I wanted to agree, but all I could think about was how to escape without making a scene. Just then, I caught sight of a woman across the room who seemed to be staring right at me. I had never seen her before, but something about her seemed familiar. It was as if she existed beyond the realm of typical strangers, standing out against the vibrant backdrop of the gallery. She wore a deep purple dress that flowed like liquid amethyst around her, and her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall. I blinked, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us dimmed, the chatter fading into silence. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I instinctively looked away, letting out a shaky breath. I was in the middle of an internal battle. I wanted to leave, but something anchored my feet to the floor. Mia tugged me toward another painting, and I felt enormous guilt rising. It was all too much. Before I could process my thoughts, I turned to Mia, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm going to head out." "No, please don't," she pleaded, her grip tightening on my arm. "Just breathe. We've barely started. Can we try to enjoy this together?" That's when I looked back at the woman, and to my astonishment, she had moved closer. In the thrumming chaos of the exhibit, she appeared as a calm presence amidst the storm. I held my breath, and somehow, her expression managed to ground me. It was as if she could see my anxiety without me saying a word. I tried to persuade myself that this was all in my head, a figment of my imagination trying to make sense of the overwhelming environment around me. But the woman tilted her head slightly, inviting me to come closer without uttering a single word. Against better judgment, I found myself drifting away from Mia, who was completely engrossed in her own conversation. I approached the woman, my heart hammering. Hi," I said, scarcely believing I had broken the silence. "Hi," she replied with a melodic, soothing voice that seemed to wrap around me like a warm embrace. "I sensed you were struggling. The energy in this place can be overwhelming, can't it?" At that moment, her understanding flooded over me like a wave, washing away some of the tension that had been clenching my chest. Yes, it really is. I heard myself say, amazed that I could speak so freely without feeling the suffocating waves of anxiety crashing down. Would you like to take a walk? She suggested, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the gallery. I hesitated, torn between my instincts to flee and the unexpected comfort I felt in her presence. I glanced back at Mia, who was in deep conversation, oblivious to my plight. The woman smiled warmly, extending her hand. Something about her felt trustworthy, calming, a stark contrast to everything else in that chaotic exhibit. I nodded, and we walked, side by side, into a more serene space. We stopped in front of a large abstract painting, the brushstrokes swirling around like a tempest. Art has a way of speaking to us, she said. Did you know that many people find solace in viewing art? It can act as a mirror to our feelings. I listened intently, mesmerized by her passion. Talking with her felt like therapy, like she was unlocking the wall I had built around myself. We stood in silence, letting the colors of the painting wash over us, and slowly, I found myself breathing easier. What's your name? I finally ventured, breaking the magical moment. I'm Alara, she replied, her eyes sparkling with a wisdom that suggested she had experienced these emotional battles herself. And you? I'm Sam, I said, a smile creeping onto my face, surprised at how natural this felt. So, how do you cope with anxiety in public? I asked, curious. Most people count to 10 or focus on something around them, but for me, it helps to connect with nature, I chuckled, not fully understanding how that applied to a crowded gallery, but intrigued by her insight. Maybe you could try it next time, Sam. Close your eyes for a moment. What do you hear? I felt a little silly, but I obliged, closing my eyes. The ambient noise faded into a hum, and for the first time that night, I wasn't only listening to the din of the crowd or feeling the weight of my anxiety, I began to hear snippets of laughter, the click of cameras, the gentle rustle of fabric as people moved. In that moment, I realized I wasn't ultimately alone in this chaos. I opened my eyes, looking at Alara. Something overwhelming shifted inside me, as if her words had crafted a lifeline through my turmoil. Thank you, Alara, I murmured, my heart lifted from a place of dread to one of possibility. She smiled knowingly, and I felt a connection that transcended our brief encounter. Just remember, the world can overwhelm us, but we have the power to connect with it. Take small steps, find what grounds you. You're stronger than your anxiety. With that, she turned away, giving me space. Mia popped into view, eyebrows raised. Where did you go? I was looking for you everywhere. She seemed oblivious to the encounter I'd just experienced, and for a moment, I hesitated, afraid that if I spoke about Alara, I might lose that sense of connection. But as I opened my mouth, I realized my fear was loosening its grip, fading like the sounds of the gallery. I met someone amazing, I finally said. I think I'll be okay. It wouldn't be the last time I faced anxiety, but in that moment, enveloped by the chaos of the evening, I held on to the wisdom Alara had unknowingly gifted me. I felt lighter, more present, as we moved through the exhibit together. Against the vibrant backdrop of color, sounds, and strangers, I found my own space to breathe, one small victory at a time. Thank you for listening to my story. I've never been one to share personal stories, especially the ones that make you cringe in retrospect, but there's something about this experience that still haunts me. I can't shake the memories of that day, the most embarrassing moment of my life, a moment that not only changed my reputation but also the way I view the world around me. It all started during my senior year of high school, in the spring semester. Our school had an annual talent show, and I had decided to showcase my passion, magic tricks. I had spent weeks preparing, practicing sleight of hand and perfecting my favorite illusion. When the day finally arrived, I was riddled with nerves, but it was also exciting. My friends had gathered to support me, and I felt ready to dazzle everyone with my grand finale, a trick I had seen that involved making a person vanish. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, filled with students and teachers alike, all eager to see what talents their peers would unveil. I went on stage, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I did some basic tricks to warm up the audience, but the highlight was supposed to be my final act. I had convinced my best friend, Jeremy, to assist me. He was always a good sport, and I thought it would be a magical moment for us both. I positioned him in a large box, announced my disappearing act, and with a flourish of my cape, I pulled the curtain closed. My heart raced as I got into the rhythm of my performance, going through the motions like I had rehearsed. I built up the suspense, waving my wand, chanting and performing all the dramatic flair that I could muster. Then I whipped open the curtain, ready to reveal an empty box. For a second, there was just a stunned silence as the audience processed what they thought they just saw. But then it hit me. Jeremy was still in the box, looking confused and a bit terrified. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to think of what to do next. I was supposed to be the magician, the master of illusion, and now I was the fool standing in front of 1,000 eyes, dead silent except for the growing laughter echoing through the crowd. I stammered, trying to recover, but all I could do was awkwardly fumble with the props until Jeremy, seeing my desperation, called out, "Hey, I'm still here." The laughter escalated. My face burned. I had to think fast. In a desperate attempt to salvage the act, I improvised, waving my hands and attempting to lift the box dramatically. But instead, I ended up knocking it over completely. It toppled over, wooden panels splintering, and Jeremy tumbled out, landing in a heap. The audience erupted into a chorus of roars and howls, the kind that would drown out any hope of regaining control. Mortified, I rushed to help him up, but the damage was done. My name became synonymous with disaster that night. As we left the stage, my mind spiraled with humiliation. My friends tried to console me, and for a moment, I thought I could brush it off as just a funny story. But, when I returned to school the following Monday, it was like walking through a minefield. Every corner I turned, I could hear whispers. "You're the magician," they'd say, bursting into laughter. I catch snippets of conversations, every one of them retelling the story of my failure, each more exaggerated than the last. It wasn't just the students, even some of the teachers joined in on the fun, chuckling to themselves. I felt like a pariah. I began avoiding the cafeteria, the hallways, even the gym. I had worked so hard to make my mark before graduation, and now it felt like my biggest legacy was going to be a colossal failure. Just as I was starting to believe that maybe I could endure this, something worse happened. One afternoon, after school, as I was gathering my things, I overheard a group of popular boys talking about the talent show. They were showing videos on their phones and laughing. My heart sank as I realized they were sharing a clip of the incident. My embarrassment streamed online without my permission. I was horrified, my face instantly flushed as I heard my voice screaming along with the laughter of the crowd. "Just look at him," one of them said, pointing at the screen. "You gotta love a magician who can't even make his friend disappear." I bolted out of there, feeling sick. That moment felt like the death knell for any semblance of a normal senior year. I withdrew from everything, skipping out on events, and stopped hanging out with friends. Instead, I spent hours in my room replaying the incident in my mind, continually wincing at the absurdity of it all. I'd become a recluse, unable to shake the crippling embarrassment that clouded my thoughts. However, just when I thought I was destined to end my high school career as a joke, things took a turn I hadn't expected. A few weeks later, I received a direct message on social media from a girl named Lydia, someone I had known casually but never talked to. She invited me to a local coffee shop where she said she wanted to chat. I was apprehensive, but the thought of being seen as nothing more than that magician started to wear on me. Some part of me craved a real connection, free of judgment and laughter. So, I agreed. When I arrived, she smiled warmly, and we started chatting. She mentioned the talent show incident as if it was just a funny story. "Honestly, I loved your act," she admitted. "You turned an embarrassing moment into something memorable, and that takes guts." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We talked for hours, sharing laughs and stories, and within a few days, we began hanging out regularly. Eventually, I told her everything, the shame and anxiety that had overwhelmed me since that day. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or mock me. Instead, she shared her own embarrassing moments, and right in that moment, I realized we all had our moments of vulnerability, sometimes even more embarrassing than mine. Through her, I found solace. Whatever heat of embarrassment I had felt transformed into something manageable. We ended up becoming close friends, and all those memories of the cruel laughter faded. I learned to face my fears head-on, to tackle my vulnerability instead of hiding from it. Through this experience, I discovered that sometimes, the only way to face the fallout of embarrassment is not to shield yourself away but to step into the light, where you can find others who understand. In time, I worked up the courage to hit the stage again, this time for an open mic night where I told my story with humor, capturing the mishap that had once haunted me and making others laugh with me instead of at me. The once dreaded moment turned into a point of connection, and as I walked off the stage that night, the wave of applause drowned out any echoes of shame that had lingered for so long. I realized that sometimes the most embarrassing moment of your life can be the seed of the greatest friendships and the most profound personal growth. How I overcame my fear of heights in adventure. I've always had a deep, gnawing fear of heights. It wasn't just discomfort, either, it was a paralyzing, gut-wrenching dread that kept me glued to the ground, miles away from anything higher than a second-floor balcony. I couldn't even look down from a tall building without my stomach twisting, my palms sweating, and my heart hammering so loudly I could feel it in my throat. The mere thought of being on the edge, looking down at the endless drop below, was enough to make me feel faint. It was irrational, I knew that, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. Over the years, I'd learned to live with it. I avoided anything that could trigger it, always finding excuses to skip activities like rock climbing or even roller coasters. My friends knew about it, my family knew about it, and I had no intention of ever confronting it head-on. That all changed one summer when my best friend, Alex, convinced me to join him on a hiking trip in the mountains. I hadn't expected him to choose a trail with sheer cliffs and precarious ledges. He'd assured me it would be a straightforward hike, one that stayed within the forest's thick cover, far from the edges that made my heart race. But as we trekked higher, I noticed the trees thinning, the air growing cooler, and the path narrowing until it became clear that we'd soon be crossing open, exposed terrain with dizzying views of the valley below. I wanted to turn back, every fiber of my being was screaming at me to find a reason to go back down, to wait at the campsite for Alex to finish on his own. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, his expression mixed with encouragement and a challenge he didn't even have to say out loud. He knew I was terrified, yet he believed I could do this. I told myself I'd give it a try, that I'd go as far as I could and stop if it got to be too much. The first real test came when we reached a narrow path carved into the side of the mountain, with nothing but a metal railing between us and a steep drop hundreds of feet below. My legs felt weak just looking at it, and my vision blurred as I gripped the railing, afraid to move any further. Alex was calm, guiding me to breathe slowly, in and out, grounding me with his voice. He showed me how to focus on each step, not on the void beside us. I kept my gaze on the rocky ground, refusing to look down, trying to ignore the knowledge that the only thing separating me from that empty space was a thin metal bar that felt flimsy and insufficient. Step by step, I made it across, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. The adrenaline was overwhelming, but as I reached the end of the section, something inside me shifted. It was as if a tiny spark of confidence ignited in my chest, a small flicker of pride that I hadn't given in to the fear. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I could handle a little more. Alex seemed to sense this, too, and he urged me onward, his own excitement contagious. We continued up the trail, each step taking us closer to the summit, and each time I felt the fear creeping back in, I'd focus on his voice, on the steady rhythm of my breathing, reminding myself that I'd made it this far and I could keep going. As we climbed higher, the views became more expansive, and I couldn't help but glance over at the breathtaking panorama that stretched out before us. The valleys, the rivers winding through the green forest, the distant peaks shrouded in mist, it was all so beautiful, yet so terrifying. But I couldn't bring myself to look away. There was a strange sense of awe mingling with the fear, a feeling I'd never experienced before. It was as if the height itself was pulling me out of my comfort zone, forcing me to confront the part of myself that had always held me back. We finally reached a plateau near the summit, where the cliff dropped sharply away into open space. Alex suggested we sit down for a while to catch our breath and take in the view. My instinct was to stay far from the edge, to keep my back pressed against the solid rock behind me, but a stronger part of me felt compelled to sit closer, to inch toward the edge and see the world spread out beneath me. I lowered myself onto the rock, legs stretched out in front of me, and looked down. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but I forced myself to keep looking, to let the fear wash over me without pulling back. I focused on the details, the texture of the rock beneath me, the way the wind felt on my face, the patterns of trees and rivers far below. And as I sat there, something incredible happened. The fear was still there, but it didn't feel as overpowering. It was as if I'd found a way to coexist with it, to acknowledge it without letting it control me. In that moment, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before, a sense of strength and resilience I didn't know I had. I realized that the fear of heights was a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I could choose to face it, to live alongside it, and in doing so, I could finally see the world from a new perspective, one that had always been out of reach. Alex noticed the change in my expression, the calmness that had replaced the panic, and he gave me a knowing smile. "See? You did it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. We sat there in silence for a while, just taking it all in, the mountains, the sky, the sheer vastness of the world around us. As we made our way back down the trail, I felt like a different person, someone who had faced one of their greatest fears and come out stronger on the other side. It wasn't a perfect victory, and I knew that my fear of heights wouldn't disappear overnight. But I had proven to myself that I could confront it, that I could push past the limits I'd imposed on myself. A few months ago, my life took an unexpected turn that I still can't shake off. It started as a typical Saturday. My 7-year-old son, Jimmy, was playing in the backyard while I was inside trying to organize some clutter, those mundane adult responsibilities no one tells you about when you first become a parent. I heard giggles and the sound of tiny feet thumping against the wooden deck. It was a beautiful day, and I briefly forgot about the mess to enjoy the serene moment of his laughter echoing through the open windows. Then, in mid-laughter, it suddenly stopped. I felt a chill creep down my spine. Parents know that silence, it's a telltale sign something is amiss. So, I rushed outside, the clutter forgotten, scanning the yard for my son. As I stepped onto the grass, I spotted him crouching near the big oak tree, peering intently at something. "What are you doing, buddy?" I called out, hoping to see him up to something harmless like collecting acorns or searching for critters. When he looked up at me, his wide, innocent eyes held a strange glimmer that made my stomach twist. "I found a treasure, Dad. Come see." He beckoned me closer, and I hesitated for a moment before making my way over. There, nestled in the roots of the tree, lay an old, rusty box. It was small, maybe a foot long and half that wide, covered in dirt and leaves that had accumulated over who knows how many years. "That's incredible, Jimmy. Where do you think it came from?" I knelt beside him, the very air thickening with anticipation. He shrugged, still not releasing his gaze from the box. "Can we open it?" For a moment, I considered saying no, the fear of what might reside inside swirling in my mind, but the curiosity was too potent. "Let's see what's inside." We pried the lid open together, the rusty hinges moaned like they were waking after a long slumber. Inside, there were old photographs, their edges frayed and yellowing with age. Most were faded images of women and men, faces I didn't recognize. But one photo caught my eye. It was of a little girl, no older than Jimmy. She stared back at me, her eyes deep blue with a haunting aura that sent shivers through me. "Who is she?" I asked, glancing at Jimmy. He simply shrugged again, completely unfazed. But as I inspected the box further, I noticed a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper beneath the photographs. I pulled it out, smoothed it across my knee, and read it aloud. "If you dare unearth the past, remember, memories can bind and haunt." The words settled in an unsettling silence, and I felt a sudden urge to close the box. "Let's put this back, it's just junk." But Jimmy shook his head, the glimmer in his eyes still shining bright, almost mischievously. "But it's ours now." He grabbed the old box and dashed towards the house. Against my better judgment, I followed him inside, a feeling of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. That night, as we sat around the dinner table, the box was the only thing on my mind. I glanced over at my son, who was excited and playing with the photographs, spreading them across the table. But slowly, I noticed something odd. Jimmy's laughter had changed, it felt deeper, almost foreign. When I asked him to help clear the table, he looked up, and for the briefest moment, I didn't see my son. His gaze was intense, and his mouth curled into a smirk I couldn't recognize. "Not yet, Dad. I'm busy." Goosebumps shot up my arms, and I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. After everything was cleared, he ran upstairs, leaving the box open on the dining table. I told myself I had to put it away, but when I glanced at it, that little girl's face seemed to almost call to me. Against my judgment, I picked up a photograph. Gazing into its haunting blue eyes, I felt a wave of emotions, a flood of laughter, and then pain. I felt memories that weren't mine rushing through me. They belonged to her. I tore my eyes away and slammed the photograph back into the box, shaken. At that moment, Jimmy came back downstairs with a small toy in hand. "Can I show you something?" he asked eagerly, that strange glimmer creeping back into his eyes. I nodded hesitantly, following him into the living room where he stood in front of the fireplace. He held up the toy, but it looked strange, like a mix between a doll and a puppet, its mouth moving slightly when he spoke. "I can make it talk." He squeezed the toy's belly, and, to my horror, a voice wafted out, not just any voice, but that of the little girl from the photograph. "Look at me. I'm your friend." Terror clawed at my insides as I stumbled back, my gaze darting to Jimmy, who was laughing hysterically as if he hadn't just unleashed something sinister upon our home. "Where did you get that?" I croaked, panic surging. "From the box," he giggled, delighting in my concern. I grabbed the box, heart racing, and snatched the puppet from his hands, but it was glued to him, refusing to let go. That's when the strange laughter transformed into something dark and taunting. "Let's play, Jimmy. Let's never stop playing." I felt nausea wash over me, and as I wrestled with the puppet, I was struck with a memory that was not mine, grotesque images swirling through my mind, a child weeping, lost, forgotten. I finally managed to yank the puppet free, and Jimmy collapsed on the floor, giggles turning into sobs. "Why did you take her away?" I didn't understand, but the chair creaked, and I looked back at the box, that old photograph lying vulnerable amidst the chaos, that girl's blue eyes drilling into my soul. "No more," I shouted, tossing the puppet into the box, slamming the lid shut as if sealing whatever horror was unleashed. I expected some kind of release, but the air felt heavier. The atmosphere thickened with a mournful sigh. I grabbed Jimmy and held him close, but behind my back, soft whispers filled the room. "You can't keep us apart." The little girl's words dripped like honey, weaving through the air. We didn't sleep that night. I held Jimmy as he trembled, whispering that everything would be okay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd unleashed something terrifying. As dawn broke, we took the box to the backyard, the little girl's image etched into my mind. I buried it deep beneath the roots of that oak tree, praying to whatever power might listen that it would stay buried and forgotten. Each year on that date, something is different. Jimmy would laugh more than normal, almost too much, as if harboring humor from the voices buried beneath the earth. But some days, he stares out the window as if waiting for something, or someone. I sometimes catch glimpses of that little girl and his smile, and every time I want to scream and pull him close. But every night, I remind him, "You are my son. Never forget that." And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I understand that this lesson isn't just for him but for me. Memories can bind, haunt, and even steal those we love because sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. Sometimes, just sometimes, the fears we bury will come back and demand to be played with again. I want to share something that happened to me recently, something I still can't wrap my head around. I've seen the posts on r/no sleep before, stories that kept me up at night, reading in the dark, the backlit screen casting shadows on my ceiling. This is my attempt to share something deeply personal, yet filled with dread. It started off as any other day. I woke up groggy, surrounded by the familiar chaos of my week-old coffee mugs and piles of laundry that seemed to have taken on a life of their own. I was burnt out, juggling long hours at work, family responsibilities, and my own never-ending expectations, mental exhaustion cascading like a waterfall onto every aspect of my life. But that day, I thought I'd try something new. I'd read about self-care rituals, the kind that supposedly rejuvenate your spirit and help you reconnect with yourself. I knew I needed a change, so I set out to give myself a day to relax, to breathe. The plan was simple: a long bath, some soothing music, maybe even indulge in that book I'd bought months ago but never opened. However, as soon as I stepped into the bathroom, that soothing serenity quickly evaporated, and an eerie sensation washed over me. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, lit the candles, and filled the tub with hot water, letting the steam envelop me. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time in forever, let myself drift into what I thought was bliss. Moments blurred, but it wasn't long before the sounds of the outside world began to fade. Just when I thought I was finally relaxing, I heard it, a faint tapping, almost rhythmic in nature, that seemed to call from somewhere within the house. I opened my eyes, heart racing, dismissing it as branches brushing against the window. The calming music I had set on repeat suddenly felt ominous, as if it were warning me of a presence I couldn't detect. I shook off the apprehension, letting the warm water cradle me, but the tapping persisted, growing slightly louder, almost impatient. I steeled myself, unwilling to emerge from my safe haven. I could handle this. I was determined to feel better, to embrace this day fully. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I finally decided enough was enough. I drained the tub and stepped out, the cool air hitting my damp skin. The moment I wrapped a towel around myself, I felt that deep, unsettling silence of my home. I took a deep breath, trying to summon courage, and padded down the hall toward the source of the tapping sound. It led me, not to a window or door, but to the basement. I hesitated. I'd hardly ventured down there after the last incident with the flooding last winter. I tried to remember why I had even been down there, hoping that my mind wouldn't conjure old fears, but the dread twisted in my stomach like a tightening coil. The tapping continued, almost rhythmic, and my curiosity morphed into a mash of anxiety and intrigue. I flicked on the overhead light, and the basement illuminated in dull, flickering radiance, like a horror movie that hadn't fully started yet. The air was thick and musty, and as I crept down the stairs, the tapping grew louder, clearer now, right against the far wall. My heart thundered against my ribs as I approached what I can only describe as a sheer wall of silence. I stood there for what felt like eternity, staring. Whatever was making that sound was relentless, almost like it was beckoning me, urging me to come closer. With trembling hands, I reached out and pressed a palm against the cold cement wall. A rush of ice shot through me. The moment I did, the tapping stopped, plunging me into an oppressive silence that echoed in my mind. Panic set in, and I jerked my hand back, irrationally afraid of whatever might lie behind that wall. I turned to retreat, but before I could reach the stairs, the wall shuddered. I froze, a primal instinct rising. Something was on the other side, so close, yet infinitely far. I barely had time to turn around when I heard it, a voice, a whisper, flowing through the cracks of that wall, "Help me." It sent chills ripping through my body. I could barely process what I had just heard. Who was that? What did it mean? The walls felt alive, pulsing with an energy that resonated in my bones. I stumbled backward, bumping into a shelf stacked with boxes, but my thoughts raced too fast, drowning out the sudden clatter. "Help me." The voice was almost pleading now, tinged with desperation, as if whatever was there needed me, and at that moment, I realized I was still trapped in my cycle of neglect, my mind's debris cluttering the corners of my existence, as if I were a prisoner in my house, in my life, consumed by chaos. Whatever had been tapping at my heart was now manifesting in a way I could no longer ignore. "Help me." I clutched my head, torn between wanting to flee and needing to understand. In that moment, clarity hit me like a ton of bricks. I had ignored myself for far too long, and now I stood at the precipice of the unknown, wanting to escape from something that had perhaps been crying for recognition all along. Fear swallowed me whole, and I turned on my heel, racing back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't look back as I pressed my back against it, chest heaving. I sank to the floor and buried my head in my hands, a tide of emotions crashing over me like dark waves. It was a terrifying reminder that neglecting my needs was a choice that had consequences, and I was witnessing the manifestation of my own despair. After what felt like hours, I finally gathered the courage to face it again, but when I returned downstairs, the silence was deafening. No tapping, no whispers, just emptiness. It struck me then, the realization that self-care was not just about pampering myself for a day, it was an ongoing commitment to acknowledge my needs, my fears, my true self, something I had been avoiding out of a sense of duty and panic. I knew I had to confront whatever lingered in the shadows of that basement, not for it to find peace, but for me to reclaim my own. That day marked the beginning of a journey I never anticipated. I didn't visit that basement again. Instead, I focused on what I truly needed to heal. I sought therapy, rediscovered joys I had cast aside, and began to embrace my fears instead of running from them. The tapping became a metaphor for the voices within that begged for recognition, and with every step I took towards self-care, I felt lighter. I no longer see that whispering voice as a threat but as a call to acknowledge the fragments of myself I had neglected. Over time, I learned self-care isn't simply a day of relaxation, it's about creating space for my spirit to breathe, to exist in fullness, and to connect with my inner self. So, if you ever think you can just push everything aside because life is too chaotic, remember this: there's a weight to ignoring your own cries for help, and sometimes it may materialize in ways you could never have imagined. Embrace your darkness, listen to the tapping, and you might just find light. When I decided to take a solo trip into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I thought I was ready to confront my fears. I'd been wrestling with anxiety for years, always held back by the suffocating grip of what-ifs. So, at the brink of my 30th birthday, I packed my backpack, laced up my boots, and took off, heart pounding with hope and apprehension. My destination was a secluded cabin, far removed from the noise of civilization. The scenic drive was beautiful, trees towering like ancient sentinels on either side of the road, the golden autumn leaves painting a picturesque view. Yet, as I approached the cabin, an unsettling feeling crept into my gut, like a warning I couldn't comprehend or dismiss. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the nerves of embarking on this personal odyssey. The first night was peaceful. The air smelled crisp and fresh, and though I heard the rustling of leaves and the distant call of coyotes, it felt comforting rather than threatening. I brewed some coffee, wrapped myself in a cozy blanket, and sat on the deck, watching the stars shimmer in a vast black sky. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a whisper told me something was off. The following morning, I woke to find a chill in the air. The towering trees seemed to whisper secrets, their branches swaying lightly despite the stillness. As I set off to explore, I chided myself for my paranoia and began my hike along a well-marked trail. Hours passed, and I soon found myself far deeper in the woods than I anticipated. The scenery was breathtaking, but my heart didn't settle. I could feel eyes on me, though I was alone. Trying to shake it off, I pushed forward, determined to embrace my fears rather than flee from them. But the deeper I went, the more pronounced the sensation became. It was as if shadows danced just beyond my sight, shapes that flitted away the instant I turned my head. Sweat beaded on my forehead. My feet moved faster, my breath quickening as panic rose. I called out to no one, hoping against hope that another hiker might emerge, that this eerie feeling would dissolve in the presence of another living soul. But there was only silence, thick, heavy silence that seemed to swallow my cries. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I spotted a break in the trees, leading to a small clearing. In the center stood a large, moss-covered rock. Something compelled me towards it. As I approached, my gaze was drawn to a peculiar carving etched into the stone. It was crude but unmistakably a depiction of a figure with elongated limbs and empty eyes, a terrifying specter that mirrored the shadows I had felt watching me. My heart raced. I took a step back but was halted by the sensation of being surrounded. There was a palpable pressure in the air, a charged stillness that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I turned to leave, but the path back was obscured, shrouded in trees that had somehow shifted. The dread pooled in my stomach, and I stumbled deeper into the clearing as panic enveloped me. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through fallen leaves, rhythmic and deliberate. I froze, the breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called, though I regretted it instantly. My voice felt small in the weight of the silence. No answer. Only the surging tide of fear cascading through my veins. I could feel it again, that sense of being watched, but now it was more pronounced, more sinister. I dug my fingernails into my palm, grounding myself against the swell of anxiety. Just as I turned to find my way back, I caught a glimpse of a figure at the edge of the trees, tall, dark, and gaunt, just like the carving on the rock. It did not move, merely stood there, towering and still, eyes void of life. I blinked, and it was gone. I bolted back towards the trail, instincts screaming at me to escape, but the forest twisted around me like a maze, every direction feeling wrong. I stumbled, my breath coming in harsh gasps, and that was when I heard it, laughter. Low, mocking laughter that echoed through the trees, cutting against the silence like a knife. My heart raced as I clawed for sanity. This isn't real, I told myself, but behind that laughter lay a truth I couldn't face. Something was out there, something I couldn't comprehend. I staggered, lungs burning, adrenaline charging through me, until I finally burst from the trees and back onto the trail, only to find myself in a different part of the woods, one I didn't recognize. My heart sank. I was lost. I tried to regain my composure, wiping the sweat from my brow and forcing myself to listen for anything familiar. But the forest was alive with sounds I hadn't heard before, whispers that swirled around me like a tangible mist, twisting my thoughts into knots. It was as if the woods were alive, laughing at my plight, coaxing me deeper into their grip. Just then, I heard it again, that laughter. It became a chorus, echoing and mocking, feeding off my terror. I broke into a run, adrenaline surging as I navigated through a path I desperately hoped would lead me out. But with each step, the laughter grew louder, merging with the sounds of the forest until it became one, an all-consuming cacophony. My heart was beating erratically, like a trapped bird slamming against a cage. I stumbled into a small ravine, falling to my knees as my body screamed for me to stop. I took a moment, collapsing against the cold earth, tears blurring my vision, filled with a mix of fear and realization. The shadows, the laughter, the eerie figure, it all reflected my deepest anxieties. I understood then that this trip had become less about exploring the wilderness and more about confronting the monstrosities lurking in my mind. Somehow, I had manifested my fears into a living nightmare. Sitting there, looking into the abyss of the ravine, I had a choice, to give in to despair or to fight through it. I chose the latter. My breathing steadied, and I stood up, brushing off the dirt. Mustering every ounce of courage, I pushed forward, refusing to let the shadows claim me. I was alive, and I would not let my fears dictate my reality. With renewed determination, I forged ahead, the laughter fading into the background. I followed the trail, navigating with a clarity that came from confronting the darkness within me. Hours later, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I stumbled upon a familiar path, the one that led to the cabin. My spirit soared with relief, though the shadows in the woods still lingered. I had confronted my fears, faced the darkest parts of my mind, and emerged transformed. As I settled back cabin, the embers of the fireplace crackling soothingly, I realized that my fears would always be there. But now, they were just echoes of my past, reminders of where I'd been and how far I'd come. That solo trip became not just an adventure into the wilderness, but a crucial journey into my soul. A reminder that while fear may lurk in the shadows, it doesn't have to control me. I learned that night that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the audacity to confront and embrace it, defying the darkness. I can't sleep, so I guess I'll share my story. It's about honesty, or at least what happens when you don't practice it. A few months ago, I was living in a sleepy little town that nobody would remember from a postcard. I was just your average guy, working a dead-end job at a convenience store, stuffing my days with mundane routines and my evenings with binge-watching whatever was trending on Netflix. But one dull Thursday evening, my life turned upside down when I met him, an older gentleman, scruffy but sharp-eyed, who walked into the store an hour before closing. My shift was almost over, and I was ready to close up. I quickly scanned him as he wandered through the aisles, picking up random snacks and looking genuinely confused. I could tell he wasn't from around here. He bought an odd mix of chips and a single cold soda. As he approached the counter, I noticed he was holding out something in his hand. It was a glossy card marked with a symbol I couldn't recognize, a circle with intricate patterns. He placed it on the counter, and his voice was gravelly but calm as he asked, "Do you believe in second chances?" He caught me off guard. I replied, "Sure. Why do you ask?" He leaned in closer, and I could smell the combination of fresh air and something else, something ancient, like the earth after a heavy rain. "I have something to show you that might change your perspective on honesty." I couldn't help but feel a shiver creep down my spine. I should have just scanned his items and sent him on his way, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you mean?" I asked. Instead of answering, he pulled a small, frayed notebook out of his jacket pocket, opening to the middle page which was filled with an elegant script. He held it up and said, "This is the Dictionary of Truths. It tells you what honesty looks like, but more importantly, what happens when you lie." I chuckled uncomfortably, thinking this was just some sort of weird prank or sales pitch, but something in his eyes told me he was dead serious. I glanced at the card one last time and shrugged. "Do I get a copy?" I joked. "No, but you're welcome to borrow it," he replied, scribbling his phone number at the bottom of the page. "Call me if you're ever interested." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving me completely bewildered. For the rest of my shift, that encounter played on loop in my mind. Who was that guy? And what was that notebook? I shook it off, but when I got home, I found myself flipping through the Notes app on my phone, staring at the number he'd given me. I felt like an idiot for even considering calling him. A week passed, and life resumed as normal, but a nagging unease settled in. I wondered about the peculiar old man and his strange proposition. Finally, late one night, I decided to just bite the bullet. I dialed the number, and to my surprise, he answered almost immediately. "You called," he said. His voice was calm but carried a weight to it. "You're interested?" "I guess I am," I replied hesitantly. "What's this thing about the Dictionary of Truths?" There was a long pause, and just as I was about to hang up, he said, "Meet me at the old oak tree on Maple Street. Midnight tomorrow." The urgency in his voice sent chills down my spine. I didn't know if I should go, but something deep inside urged me to follow through. The next night, I stood beneath the sprawling branches of the oak, my heart racing. The night was eerily silent, and I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, emerging from the shadows, the old man approached, the same notebook in hand. "Let's begin," he said, flipping the pages until he landed on one with a list titled Consequences of Lies. The words felt heavy, loaded with meanings I couldn't yet grasp. He started recounting stories from the pages, incidents where a small lie spiraled out of control until someone was left destroyed in its wake. One story stuck with me. It was about a family man who had lied about a job. In trying to impress his friends, he claimed he was doing well financially, but when the truth emerged, it shattered his home. The deception led to distrust. The wife left, taking the kids. It sounded like a cliché, but something twisted in my gut told me this wasn't just a story. The old man looked at me and said, "Every lie is a thread, and with enough threads, you weave a tapestry of destruction." I wanted to laugh it off, but as he spoke, I felt that familiar pit forming in my stomach. I walked away that night feeling more confused than enlightened. I didn't want to believe what he was saying, but the ideas clung to me. That next week, I encountered scenarios where dishonesty seemed tempting, like lying to my boss about why I needed a week off or fabricating an excuse to break plans with a friend. Each time, I could hear the old man's voice echoing in my mind, warning me against the consequences. One night, ironically, I was at a bar with friends. They dared me to exaggerate how well things were going in my life just for fun. I was tipsy and felt bold, so I started weaving a tale about a promotion and a new car. I lit up as I shared, feeding off their laughter, but as I spoke, I saw the flicker of concern in the eyes of my childhood friend, Sarah. She knew me better than anyone. The moment the night ended, she pulled me aside. "You're lying, aren't you?" she said softly. A flood of guilt crashed over me. I could have confessed then, but rather, I shrugged and laughed, telling her it was all in good fun. As the days turned into weeks, I felt my act of dishonesty festering. I noticed I was starting to isolate myself from my friends, growing anxious and withdrawn. I ignored Sarah when she reached out. I made excuses. I buried myself in work and avoided social situations. It all came to a head one night when I bumped into the old man again outside the store. His eyes met mine, and I felt a pang of shame. "You've been dishonest," he said, and it wasn't phrased as a question. I stammered, trying to defend myself, but he cut me off. "You're lying to everyone, including yourself. If you don't change, the lies will catch up to you, and they will hurt." I was furious. I felt trapped, his words hanging like an anvil over my head. But deep down, I knew he was right. I walked back home that night, anger morphing into dread. I finally picked up the phone and tried to call Sarah, but what if she didn't want to hear from me? What if I had already ruined things with her? The old man's words haunted me, yet I could feel something breaking open, a crack allowing light to seep through. As I sat in my room, I felt compelled to reach out and tell Sarah the truth about everything I'd been hiding. I stared at the phone, tracing my fingers over the screen, but then doubt swallowed me whole again. The nagging sense of inadequacy surged within me. I could either hold on to the safe illusion I created, my fabricated perfect life, or embrace the fear of vulnerability. That battle went on for weeks until one evening, I found myself in front of my bathroom mirror, shaking. The toll was nearing its breaking point. I felt unworthy of my friendships, convinced they'd all abandon me if they knew who I truly was. That's when I caught a glimpse of the worn pages of that notebook. After days of ignoring it, I finally picked it up from its hiding spot, where I had tossed it. I began flipping through its pages, each one dripping with honest accounts of people who suffered because of lies, the emotional scars that followed them. I felt like I was facing my own shortcomings, each page a reflection of my fears. Tentatively, I dialed Sarah's number, my heart racing in despair as the phone rang. "Hey," she answered, sounding cheerful, but I could hear the hint of caution in her tone when she recognized my voice. "What's up?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I was holding. "Can we talk?" I felt the silence stretch like an eternity before she finally said, "Sure. I'm here." I spilled everything, the lies, my fears, how I felt like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. As I spoke, I felt something shift, a release, a sense of freedom. It felt surreal, like I was shedding skin. She was there, listening, her voice soft and understanding. In that moment, I realized honesty wasn't a weakness, it was a bridge back to my true self. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. My heart raced until she finally whispered, "Thank you for telling me." The relief was palpable, and I could feel bonds reweaving, foundations being rebuilt. It was the hardest conversation I ever had, but I learned that honesty was indeed the hardest thing to face, but it was also the most liberating. After that night, I found myself reaching out to others, mending relationships that had frayed under my web of lies. The old man disappeared from my life, but his words lingered, echoing in my actions. I eventually learned to embrace vulnerability, to show my true self without the masks of deception. So, if you ever find yourself tempted to weave a story that isn't true, just know that honesty can be a hard journey, but the pain of lying is a far greater burden. I wish I could thank that old man, but sometimes I think he was simply a stranger who was meant to guide me through a dark time. So remember this, honesty might not always be easy, but it can set you free in ways you never imagined. When my siblings stole my thunder, a family drama. When my siblings stole my thunder, a family drama. When my siblings stole my thunder, it wasn't just a momentary embarrassment, it became the catalyst for an unraveling that none of us anticipated. I should probably begin by saying that my older sister, Mia, has always been the star. From childhood beauty pageants to academic accolades, everything she touched seemed to turn to gold. I was the overlooked one, the shadow that trailed behind her. I would go through the motions, studied hard, but always in her shadow. Then came the year of my high school graduation. The evening of the ceremony was supposed to be mine, my moment to shine with my family beaming with pride. Anticipation built. My parents decorated the kitchen, balloons, and streamers announcing my achievement. But as the night drew closer, my parents received an unexpected call. Mia had scored a role in a major international film, she would be flying out to Los Angeles immediately. I remember the sheer joy in my mother's voice as she spoke with Mia over the phone and the way my father's eyes lit up in a way I had only seen during my own achievements. In the back seat of our family car, a knot began to grow in my stomach. The day of my graduation felt like a thin veil stretched taut around what should have been a joyous occasion. The ceremony happened as planned, but I'll never forget looking into the audience and seeing my parents enjoying the news of Mia's film instead of celebrating my special day. I walked across that stage, clutching my diploma tightly, but with every step, I felt like I was losing a part of myself. Sure enough, after the ceremony, we gathered at home, set up a small celebration just for me. My friends were excited, ready to cheer, but Mia's success loomed over us like an ominous cloud. On the kitchen counter lay my cake, decorated with congratulations. But it sat next to Mia's movie poster, hastily taped on the wall, its presence overpowering every variation of happy from my friends. I was slowly losing my voice in my own story. As the night wore on, I couldn't take it anymore. In a moment of frustration, I bolted upstairs and locked myself in my room. That night, I typed a fierce message to Mia, venting all my pent-up emotions. I pressed send, knowing it might ignite a storm. But I needed her to know the cost of her thunderstorm. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed violently with a response. "You're being ridiculous. This is my dream. Celebrate your own success instead of envying mine." I felt a whirlwind of anger and sadness mix in my gut, leaving me nauseous. I put my phone down and stared out of the window. The world outside felt so disconnected, even cold. That winter felt endless. Mia remained in LA, making waves while I sank back into the familiar role of the forgotten backup singer. Social media became my battleground. Every post, every tagged photo was a reminder of her glow overwhelming my struggle. I was slowly losing not just the battle, but the war for attention. Desperate, I turned to online forums. I poured my thoughts into anonymous posts, sharing pieces of my life under a pseudonym. I critiqued my family's dynamic, my sister's success that overshadowed mine, hoping for validation. Lurkers and commenters provided sympathy, some more than others, helping me feel understood. But in that anonymity, I found solace. One night, as I scrolled through /no sleep, I realized something. It did not matter what was happening out there, I could create my own worlds where I was no longer the shadow. The forum became my salvation, a place where my stories could take flight without the restriction of familial expectations. I poured my bottled emotions into horror tales grafted from my insecurities, and to my surprise, people loved them. They thrived on the darkness spun from the very shadow that was stifling me. In a matter of weeks, my posts gained a following, fairy tale horrors that spun widely in the imagination of strangers. I could get lost in my stories where my characters were powerful, driving their own narratives, defying their backgrounds of invisible confinement. Yet, amidst my success, there was an eerie emptiness that began to cling to my heart. Sure, I was celebrating some form of victory, but it was furtive beneath my growing resentment for Mia. My posts turned into a ritual. I craved the validation from people I would never meet. But then, one dark evening, fate took another turn. It started on Reddit when a user sent me a private message. It was Mia. She had stumbled upon my anonymous posts and was hurt. "You don't even know me anymore." It was simple, cut deep. After checking my uploads and realizing how I described our family dynamic, how I painted her image in hues of arrogance and ignorance, I turned cold. I couldn't find words. I felt exposed. However, I just sat there, frozen, staring at her message as if it were a gaping wound. Then the next day, news broke that Mia was in a scandal. Videos leaked revealing her backstage meltdowns and entitlement, coupled with her rising fame. Suddenly, the spotlight shifted. People began to question the authenticity of the image she had cultivated. My world began to swirl, each revelation making her less of a beacon and more of a fallen star. As she faced her public, my own path became illuminated, filled with the stories I created. I began to open up more about my life, my truths as a shadow, turning pain into art. I gained followers who resonated with my moral tales, feeding me a sense of belonging I had long sought. But was my newfound voice birthed from her demise? It left stains on my conscience. One evening, Mia called, and I picked up, trepidation plugged into my chest. I discovered a frail fragment of the sister I once knew, a fractured soul clinging to her past identity while grappling with her present. Our conversation unfolded slowly, layered with insecurities, apologies for the hurt we each caused. It was a confession, the recognition of our battle as siblings overshadowed by each other's quest for acknowledgement. As we spoke, I realized the shared burden. We both felt like puppets in the family arena, one volatile thread feeding off the other's plight. We broke through that dark night, trading our perception of each other. There is nuance behind success and storms. We might have shared shade but didn't have to be enemies. Weeks passed, and amid all the throes of her scandal, the dynamics slowly shifted. I took steps toward my achievements unencumbered, no longer a shadow but a bystander cheering for the sky where Mia soared. Together, we moved through our narrative, co-authors rather than competitors. Isn't it striking how sibling rivalry can feel like blood on the walls of a haunted house? We each created our stories entwined yet distinct, experiencing thunder not as theft but a shared awakening. It's hard to find peace, but sometimes harmony is merely accepting each other's voices alongside our own, even as we wade through the chaos of family and the horrors of an unseen war. Each of us forever balancing the fine line of shared thunder, transcending the shadows to claim the light you embody, teasing the echoes of a raging storm to harmonize melodies instead of drown beneath them. How I handled a difficult client, a professional growth story. When I first started working at the marketing agency, I thought I was ready for anything. I'd been through college, internships, and enough late nights to feel like I could handle the pressure. But nothing could have prepared me for Vanessa Crawford. She wasn't just any client, she was the client. CEO of a multi-million-dollar fitness empire, she was known for her relentless perfectionism and her ability to reduce even the most seasoned professionals to nervous wrecks. When the account was assigned to me, everyone in the office looked at me with a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. I was the youngest on the team, barely 6 months in, and somehow, I was now responsible for handling our most high-profile, high-stakes client. My boss, Adam, had this way of smiling like he was doing me a favor when, in reality, he was throwing me to the wolves. "You'll grow from this," he said, which I later realized was code for, "good luck surviving." The first meeting with Vanessa set the tone. She strode into our conference room like she owned the place, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her handshake was firm, her gaze piercing. As I began my presentation, she interrupted within the first 2 minutes. "This isn't going to work," she said flatly, pointing at one of the slides. "Redo it." My carefully crafted ideas were shredded within seconds. Every question I answered seemed to spark another round of criticism, and by the end of the meeting, I was questioning every decision I'd ever made. "We'll reconvene next week," she said, standing up abruptly. "Don't waste my time again." The door clicked shut, leaving me and my colleagues in stunned silence. Over the next few days, I barely slept. I went over her comments again and again, obsessing over how to improve. I knew Vanessa wasn't just difficult, she was testing me. She wanted to see if I could rise to her standards or crumble like so many before me. I redid the entire proposal, pouring every ounce of creativity and strategy I had into it. The next meeting was slightly better. She still criticized almost everything, but there was a moment, a brief flicker, where I saw her nod slightly at one of my ideas. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel me. I realized that Vanessa respected confidence and preparation. She didn't want someone who would just roll over and agree with her, she wanted someone who could challenge her, push back intelligently, and prove they were just as invested in her success as she was. It became a game of strategy. I started anticipating her objections before she made them, preparing counterarguments that were solid and backed by data. When she shot down one idea, I immediately had 3 alternatives ready to go. I stopped taking her criticism personally and started using it as fuel. Every "this isn't good enough" became a challenge to outdo myself. But it wasn't just about the work, it was about understanding her. I began to notice the small tells in her demeanor, the way she tapped her pen when she was actually intrigued, the way her tone softened slightly when she was pleased, even if she never said so outright. I learned to read between the lines, to recognize her approval hidden behind her relentless drive for perfection. The turning point came about 2 months into the project. We were finalizing a major campaign, and Vanessa called me at 10 p.m., clearly agitated. "This tagline doesn't capture the brand," she said, her voice sharp. I was exhausted and tempted to agree just to get off the call, but something in me pushed back. "Vanessa, I think it does," I said, my voice steady. "Here's why." I walked her through the reasoning, tying it back to her vision, her values, and her audience. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "All right," she finally said. "Let's go with it." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever gotten from her, and it felt like winning an Olympic gold medal. By the time the campaign launched, Vanessa was still as demanding as ever, but there was a shift. She started addressing me directly in meetings, asking for my opinion instead of dismissing it outright. When the campaign results came in, showing a massive increase in engagement and sales, she actually smiled. "Good work," she said, and I swear it felt like I'd just been knighted. The experience taught me more than any class or internship ever could. It wasn't just about learning to handle a difficult client, it was about learning to adapt, to persevere, and to grow under pressure. Vanessa didn't just push me, she forced me to find a level of resilience and capability I didn't know I had. Looking back, I realized that the experience wasn't just professional growth, it was personal growth. It taught me that even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, there's always a way forward if you're willing to put in the effort and stay true to yourself. Vanessa remains one of the most challenging clients I've ever worked with, but she's also the one who pushed me to be better. And for that, I'm strangely grateful. How I accidentally became the office hero. It all started on a typical Wednesday morning. The office was bustling with its usual monotony, emails to send, meetings to attend, reports to prepare. I was just another cog in the wheel, trying to get through the workday without attracting too much attention. I was never the type to stand out at work. I was the quiet one, the one who stayed under the radar and did my job without causing any waves. It's not that I didn't want to be noticed, but I didn't exactly crave the spotlight either. I was content to stay in my lane, keep to myself, and let the more outgoing personalities take the lead. But everything changed when the coffee machine broke. It sounds trivial, I know, but it was the catalyst for something that would turn my entire life upside down. The coffee machine was the lifeblood of the office. We had a fancy espresso machine that made the best coffee in town, and everyone depended on it. People would come into work, grab their morning cup, and immediately feel ready to take on the world, or at least take on their inbox. But that morning, as I shuffled into the break room, I saw it: the coffee machine was down. The display screen blinked red with an error message I didn't understand. I could hear people grumbling in the background, the murmur of discontent growing louder as the realization hit everyone. There would be no coffee today. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I wasn't the most tech-savvy person in the office, and I certainly wasn't the one people turned to for problem-solving. But I couldn't ignore the growing chorus of complaints around me. So, without really thinking, I did what any reasonable person would do: I tried to fix the coffee machine. I didn't know the first thing about how it worked, but I knew I couldn't just stand there and watch people spiral into a caffeine-deprived panic. I started pressing buttons, fiddling with the machine's components, hoping that somehow, I'd accidentally trigger the right response. To my surprise, after a few minutes of trial and error, the machine hummed to life. It sputtered for a moment, then began to brew coffee as if nothing had ever gone wrong. I stood there, stunned. I had actually fixed it. I turned around, and the entire break room had fallen silent. Everyone was staring at me, their mouths agape, like I'd just performed a miracle. "You fixed it?" someone asked, disbelief in their voice. I nodded, suddenly feeling very self-conscious. People began to applaud, clapping slowly at first, then growing louder as they realized what had just happened. "Thank God," someone muttered. "We were going to have to go to Starbucks." The applause continued as people grabbed their cups of coffee, murmuring praise as they passed by me. At that moment, I felt a strange sense of pride, but it was short-lived. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I was just trying to help out. But something about the way people reacted stuck with me. Word of my heroic act spread like wildfire throughout the office. Suddenly, people started coming to me with their tech issues, asking if I could help them troubleshoot their computer problems, fix their printers, or even recommend software. I wasn't qualified for any of this. I was just the guy who fixed the coffee machine, but to everyone else, I was some kind of office wizard. It was flattering, but also a little overwhelming. I started receiving emails from people I barely knew, asking for my help. It felt like I couldn't escape it. It wasn't long before my boss, who had been in the back of the room during the coffee machine incident, took notice. "You're really good at solving problems, huh?" she said one afternoon as she caught me on my way to lunch. "Maybe we should get you more involved in some of the office's tech issues." I was stunned. Me? Involved in office tech? I barely knew how to work the projector in the conference room. But before I could decline, she handed me a folder and told me to take a look at some upcoming projects. Apparently, my coffee machine incident had branded me as the office's go-to tech guy. The next few weeks were a blur. I started fixing printers, organizing software installations, and answering questions about email configurations, all tasks I was woefully unqualified to handle. But somehow, I made it work. Every time I fixed something, I could feel the weight of the office's expectations pressing down on me. It wasn't just about the coffee machine anymore. I had become the person people turned to when something went wrong. My colleagues, who once barely acknowledged my presence, were now coming to me for advice, asking for my opinion, and even inviting me to lunch. I was getting invited to team meetings I had no business being in, and somehow, I was becoming part of the office's inner circle. It felt good, at first. I enjoyed the recognition, the newfound friendships, and the sense of purpose that came with being the hero. But over time, it started to wear on me. I wasn't a tech expert. I didn't want to be the person people relied on for everything. I just wanted to do my job and go home. The pressure built, and I started to feel suffocated. I couldn't go a day without someone asking me for help with something. It was like I had accidentally signed up for a role I wasn't prepared for. One morning, after fixing yet another printer issue for the 10th time that week, I found myself staring at the break room door, wondering if I could just take the coffee machine and run away with it. I wanted to escape. I wanted to go back to being the quiet, unnoticed person I had been before. But as I looked around the office, I realized something: I had made a difference. People were relying on me, yes, but they were also appreciating me in a way I hadn't experienced before. They trusted me. And maybe, just maybe, that was something worth holding on to. I never set out to be the office hero. It just kind of happened. I didn't have a plan, didn't expect it, and certainly didn't ask for it. But in the end, I learned something important: sometimes the greatest things in life come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, being the hero doesn't mean having all the answers, it just means being willing to step up when it matters most. So, while I may not be the office wizard I'm made out to be, I've learned to embrace my accidental role. After all, no one's ever too old to be surprised by how much they can achieve. When I learned the power of kindness, it wasn't in some grand display or heartwarming moment. No, it all started with a small gesture, a simple act that spiraled into something I could have never anticipated. It was a cold November evening, the kind that chills your bones and turns the air to ice. I remember huddling in my worn-out hoodie, desperately awaiting the bus that seemed perpetually delayed. The stop was empty except for me, and my thoughts were a tangled mess of worries, bills, deadlines, and feelings of inadequacy gnawing at my gut. Just when I thought I might freeze solid, I noticed an old man shuffling towards me, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His clothes were threadbare, and his shoes looked like they'd seen better decades. As he approached, he noticed me and offered a timid smile that crinkled the deep lines of his weathered face. That small gesture broke through the gloom of my own troubles. I returned his smile, albeit weakly, and struck up a conversation. I learned his name was Harold, a local artist who had fallen on hard times but still carried a twinkle in his eye when he spoke of his passion for painting. As we talked, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For once, my worries faded into the background as I listened to his stories about the vibrant art community that once thrived in our town before the economic decline. I was mesmerized by his tales of vibrant colors and creativity that lit up our dull surroundings. When the bus finally arrived, I felt like I knew the man standing by me, like somehow, I had been enriched by his presence. As I turned to leave, I reached into my pocket for a few crumpled dollar bills. "Here, Harold, take this. I know it's not much, but I hope it can help." His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked as if he might refuse. But then he took the money, his hand trembling, and whispered a heartfelt thank you. I walked onto the bus feeling lighter than air, believing I had made a tiny difference in someone's life. That's when the eerie part began. Over the following weeks, I started running into Harold everywhere I went, at the grocery store, the park, even outside my own apartment. It was uncanny. More than that, he was always smiling, always animatedly talking to anyone who would listen about his art. It became a ritual of sorts. We would share brief conversations whenever our paths crossed. I learned more about him and the profound impact of kindness, not just the act itself, but the ripples it creates. A few weeks later, things took a strange turn. One morning, I woke up to a flood of notifications on my phone. My social media feeds were filled with posts about Harold. I clicked through to find that he had become a local sensation. Someone had taken a video of him painting murals on abandoned buildings, transforming blank walls into brilliant expressions of hope. Subtle colors danced across decayed structures, and suddenly the town that had felt so lifeless began to breathe again. People were rallying behind him, sharing his art, even donating supplies and funds for more projects. It was a grassroots effort born from his sheer will to uplift others through art, a living testament to the power of kindness. But then, things began to unravel. One evening, as I took my usual route home, I noticed something odd. The mural that Harold had painted on the side of a rundown cafe was vandalized, splashed with graffiti that read "Art is dead." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Pushing through the crowd gathered outside, I could see Harold standing there, his body trembling, eyes wide, looking utterly devastated. I couldn't help but rush over to him. "Harold, I'm so sorry. I don't understand who could do this." He looked at me, his face pale, and quietly said, "Sometimes, kindness attracts jealousy." I didn't understand what he meant until later that night when I scrolled through social media and saw people arguing over the vandalism. Some praised Harold's work, while others tore him down, calling him a fraud, a charlatan. And still, I thought, how could someone hate such beauty? Days passed, and Harold's spirits seemed to dim with each conversation. He would paint less, his bright smile replaced with a haunted look. I found myself resolved to stand by my friend. Together, we organized a cleanup event, inviting anyone willing to restore the murals. I spread the word online, rallying the community to come out, to show that kindness would triumph over hate. The turnout was astonishing. On that chilly Saturday morning, the once lonely streets filled with laughter, conversation, and a shared purpose. People of all ages brought brushes, paint, and food, eager to contribute. As we painted over the graffiti, Harold stood among us, visibly moved as we brought his vision back to life. The sense of unity was palpable, a stark contrast to the negativity that had blanketed our town just days before. But as the sun set that evening, something darker lurked just on the outskirts of the happiness we had created. That night, I received a frantic call from Harold. They did it again. The mural by the old theater. Please come. My heart raced, sensing the urgency in his voice. I rushed over, and as I turned the corner, adrenaline surged through me. The mural stood untouched, but Harold was there, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his shaking hands. They left this, he muttered, showing me the note which read, "Stop painting. Your kindness is unwelcome here." Anger flared in me like wildfire. I wanted to lash out, to find whoever had spread this senseless cruelty and confront them. Instead, I looked at Harold. What do we do? He thought for a moment and then slowly said, "We keep painting." The next day, we did exactly that. We unleashed a flood of color upon the streets of our town, determined to show that love could conquer hate one brushstroke at a time. We painted murals of hope, kindness, and resilience, despite the threats and condemnation we faced. And the strangest thing happened, slowly but surely, the tide began to shift. Our movement grew larger, drawing in more and more support each day. People began sharing their own stories of kindness, sharing their art, their music, their love for each other. Kindness had become a battle cry, a movement that refused to die. I could see the change taking place, a transformation not just in our town but within Harold himself. His light began to shine again, though I could tell he still had scars from the negativity directed toward him. One night, sitting on a freshly painted bench in the midst of our latest mural, I turned to Harold and said, "Thank you for showing me this, all of this. I never realized how deeply kindness could affect others." He shot me a soft smile and replied, "It's not always smooth, but kindness is a powerful weapon. Use it wisely." From that moment, I made a vow to carry those words with me. I wanted to share the lessons I learned with everyone, even those who didn't care to hear. I wanted the world to know that even the smallest gesture could grow into something monumental. So, while the world outside might still be full of pain and hatred, I carried forth the light we had created together. I encouraged others to embrace the tenderness life has to offer, to take a moment to listen, to create, to love. Because in that chaos between darkness and light, I discovered that every time kindness blooms, it unfolds in unexpected ways, reminding us all that even a small gesture can change everything. I had spent my entire life in a small town where everyone knew each other's names, and quirks, and perhaps, their darkest secrets. Growing up, I fought for my individuality, to be seen as more than just another face in a crowd. It was a place where everyone was friendly, where the smiles felt a little too wide, and the laughter a little too loud, rendering the palpable tension. It was during one of those regular, sunlit Saturdays when everything changed. On that day, I was volunteering at the community center. Jean, the old librarian, had finally allowed me to help with the book drives, and I felt like I was part of something big. I was sorting through the donations when I overheard two women whispering at the corner table, their voices like twisted vines creeping into my ears. "I heard she's been talking to him again," one said, her tone coated with venom, and my stomach dropped. They weren't just murmuring about any guy, they were talking about David, my ex-boyfriend, the awkwardly charismatic guy whose smirk could brighten the darkest day. Despite a messy breakup, he and I had rekindled what felt like the tiniest flicker of friendship. The thing is, I had no idea that people still thought we had more going on, because from my perspective, we were just friends. Fueled by panic and a desperate need to defend my reputation, I confronted them, perhaps aggressively, even. "Excuse me, what are you gossiping about?" Their shock was evident, but I steeled myself against their wide eyes and freckles of surprise. It wasn't long before the news spread through the community like wildfire. I had gone from the unassuming volunteer to the notorious girl who couldn't let go of her past. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder, accompanied by snickers and derisive looks that felt like knives carving up my pride. Gradually, the entirety of Cliffside became a tangled web of misunderstandings. Friends began avoiding me, backing away slowly as if I were the plague. Even my closest confidant, Linda, stopped returning my calls. I was left to drown in a sudden sea of isolation, and with it came an overwhelming desire to clear up the mess. But there was a problem: the more I tried to clarify things, the worse it became. My attempts seemed to confirm the town's suspicions. Each denial only fueled the gossip mill, and instead of defending my innocence, I was seen as defensive. It felt like a fight I could never win, and my spirit sank with every passing day. Desperate for reclaiming my voice, I hosted an open event at the community center. My intent was simple: a gathering that focused on unity, an open dialogue to bridge the chasms and resolve misunderstandings. I figured if everyone came together and listened, surely common sense would prevail. I spent the week preparing for the event. Flyers were painted with hopeful phrases about forgiveness and community, and I offered free snacks, a subtle attempt to lure them in. The evening arrived, and I felt like a shipwrecked sailor standing on the shore, nervously anticipating a tide of judgment. I stood in front of a small, slightly uninterested crowd, and a nervous breeze swept through me. "Thanks for coming," I began, my voice trembling at the edges. I invited everyone to talk about the things happening around our community recently. The room felt tight with both enthusiasm and skepticism, but I pushed ahead. I shared heartfelt stories about the importance of unity and understanding. I urged everyone to reflect before jumping to conclusions. But my words floated aimlessly, like balloons drifting on a gentle breeze. People were too set in their narratives to listen, and it stung. There was one woman, Vivian, a longtime resident, who finally stood up, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Why should we believe you? You've constantly brushed aside the truth." My throat tightened, but I remained silent. As the night grew long, the disappointment weighed on my shoulders. It seemed as if hope had slipped through my fingers like sands of time. Then, just as I was about to give up entirely, a soft voice emerged from the back of the room. "You know, it's strange how quickly we turn on each other," said Sarah, a newcomer to Cliffside who I only knew from a few small exchanges. "It feels easy to parrot rumors but harder to find out the truth." I caught on to her words like a lifeline tossed out in a storm. Other murmurs began to ripple through the room as others picked up on her sentiment. It's terrible how we let gossip drive our actions and thoughts. There are real people with real feelings at stake. Suddenly, it was like the curtains had been flung wide open. Conversations erupted, people began sharing their own experiences of being misunderstood. I couldn't believe how everyone had flown in and out of a cycle of blame, each person caught up in the net of conflict, often making life-changing decisions based on baseless gossip. There were those who stepped forward, apologizing for jumping to conclusions, some who admitted they were caught up in the drama without considering what it meant for me, or anyone else. My heart lifted as I saw the walls of judgment begin to crumble. We spoke late into the night, laughter mingling with tears, face-to-face revelations turning quiet whispers of resentment into a collective understanding of how fragile relationships can be. By the end of the evening, I felt an unexpected sense of grace wash over me. What had started as an attempt to douse flames had morphed into a chance for healing. Leaving the community center, I could finally breathe. I realized grace was more than just a mere act, it was an intricate dance of vulnerability and openness. Misunderstandings happen in every facet of life, the key lies not in how we protect ourselves but in how we handle the resulting chaos. And sometimes, even when the world feels like it's tearing at the seams, bridging gaps with understanding might just be the way to sew everything back together. So that's how I handled a misunderstanding with grace, embracing imperfections and learning to let others in. Sometimes it's even worth betting against the odds when it means creating a stronger bond within a fractured community. It was one of those days where everything seemed to fall apart before I even had a chance to make it out the door. I woke up late, my alarm clock blinking 8:37 a.m., already 37 minutes behind for work. As I scrambled to throw on a wrinkled shirt and a pair of mismatched socks, I could hear my cat, Jinx, meowing incessantly from the other room. My boss had already sent 2 texts asking where I was, and I could feel anxiety start to creep in. I rushed down the stairs, forgetting to grab breakfast, and nearly tripped over Jinx, who suddenly decided to cross my path. A couple of scratched legs from Jinx later, I was out the door, cursing the universe under my breath. I jumped into my car, hoping that traffic would play in my favor. Spoiler alert, it didn't. I hit every red light, and as I sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic, I felt the weight of frustration settling heavily on my shoulders. I finally pulled into the parking garage only to realize I'd forgotten my parking pass. Another delay. Another text from my boss. Finally, I trudged to my office, and the day dragged on like a snail in molasses. Every small task seemed monumental, and I could feel my ability to cope waning by the minute. I barely had a lunch break, and by the time I was back at my desk, the panic started to settle in. To top it all off, I noticed a small, frayed rip in my shirt that I hadn't seen earlier. Humiliated and desperate, I decided I needed to escape my office, if only for a few minutes. I headed to the small park nearby, hoping some fresh air could clear my mind. As I walked, I couldn't shake a horrible feeling that something bad would happen next. Maybe I would get hit by a squirrel, who knows? The world had it out for me that day. When I finally reached the park, I sat on a bench, my head in my hands, feeling completely overwhelmed. Just then, an elderly man on a nearby bench caught my eye. He was feeding the birds, chuckling to himself, seemingly untethered from the chaos I was feeling. He looked at me, and for some unknown reason, tilted his head toward the empty spot next to him. "Sit down," he said, kindness sparking in his eyes. I hesitated but felt an odd pull to join him. Maybe it was the desperation of the day weighing me down, but I complied. "Bad day?" he asked, without any judgment or prying. I sighed. "You could say that. Just one of those days." He nodded knowingly, as if he'd been through 100 of them in his lifetime. "Let me tell you a story." He paused for dramatic effect before continuing. He spoke about a time in his life when he lost everything: his wife, his job, his home. I listened intently as he narrated how he had ended up sitting on a park bench much like the one we were on, utterly defeated and unsure of his next steps. But instead of succumbing to despair, he made a conscious decision to start looking for the good in life, no matter how small. Staring at the pigeons, he found solace in their simplicity and the freedom they exuded. He offered breadcrumbs to the birds each day, and in time, he began to notice the small joys around him. A child laughing, the sun peeking through the clouds, the vibrant colors of falling leaves in autumn. With each little joy, his heart felt a little lighter. He kept coming back to that bench, day after day, and with time, he found a community of people who also frequented that park. They shared their stories, their laughter, and gradually he rebuilt his life through these connections. He then looked at me with piercing eyes and said, "Each day can be a canvas, it's up to you to paint a picture worth hanging on the wall." His words struck a chord deep within me. After our chat, I felt inspired. I thanked him and headed back to work, determined to shift my perspective. As I walked, I started to notice things I had previously overlooked: the sound of leaves rustling, the smell of fresh coffee wafting from a nearby cafe, the way the sunlight danced across the pavement. Weirdly, I even began to appreciate the scar from Jinx's earlier scratching. Later that day, I got creative with my projects at work. Instead of rushing to finish tasks, I poured my energy into them, transforming them from mundane duties into opportunities for innovation. I was attentive, bringing joy into even the dullest of tasks. As the workday came to a close, I noticed a glimmer of excitement from my boss as he complimented my efforts. He even asked if I'd be willing to lead a project that had been stagnating for some time. I couldn't believe it. My bad day started forging into something beautiful. After work, I decided to stop by that park again. The old man wasn't there, but I could feel his presence lingering, and suddenly, I understood what he meant. Within the chaos of life, the traffic, the scratches, the misfits, I was capable of finding meaning. I reached for my phone and typed out a message to a friend I hadn't spoken to in a while, inviting them to share a coffee with me. I felt lighter, and when that familiar weight of dread threatened to settle, I reminded myself of the old man's words: I had the ability to paint my world. That night, as I sat with my friend, laughing over memories and sharing dreams, I couldn't help but think of how one simple conversation had transformed my perspective. I realized that every bad day is just a chapter in a larger story, one that's waiting to be rewritten with the brushstrokes of positivity. So, if you ever find yourself in the trenches of despair, remember it's not the bad days that define us, but how we choose to turn them around. You have the power within you to shift your narrative, to paint your picture in vibrant colors, and sometimes, all it takes is a conversation with a stranger to see the beauty waiting to unfold. When I faced a major setback and bounced back, I had no idea how different my life was about to become. It all started with a simple email. I was a tech startup founder, and after years of hard work, we had finally secured funding for the project I believed would revolutionize the way people communicate. We were set to launch our app within a month. We had everything in place, a sharp team, a polished product, and a marketing strategy that was meant to skyrocket us into the tech stratosphere. I was confident, even cocky in the way that only an entrepreneur can be, until that fateful Wednesday morning. It was the same day I decided to check my email over coffee, something I usually do while half asleep, still in my pajamas. When that email notification pinged, I wouldn't have guessed it would change everything. I opened it to discover a message from my investor, my biggest backer, and what I found left me cold. The subject line read "Regrettable decision," and my heart sank as I began to read. He claimed we'd make better use of the funds if we redirected our focus. After months of hard work, he had backed out entirely, claiming the tech landscape had changed too much in light of some larger competitors entering the space at the last minute. I couldn't believe it. We had meetings scheduled, a launch party booked, and suddenly, everything seemed to unravel. In sheer disbelief, I sat there staring at the screen, unmoving as the world outside continued spinning. The room felt like it was closing in on me, my heart pounding in my ears. Panic constricted my throat. I spent the next hours in a fog. I let it fester, this sense of impending doom. I tried to reach out for support, but each attempt felt increasingly futile. The people close to me didn't understand the tech world like I did, and my friends didn't know what to say when I dropped this bombshell on them. To make matters worse, the looming deadline felt like a noose tightening around my neck. It was like I was faced with a dark chasm, and I could see nothing but the bottomless pit of my shattered dreams. Days passed and nothing seemed to improve. I couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My co-founders waited, anxiously monitoring my every move, but I felt like a skeleton of the person I used to be. Their concern was palpable. They wanted me to pick up the pieces, but how do you do that when every piece feels crushed into dust? One day, as I sat in silence in my cluttered apartment, a stray thought flickered in my mind. What if I simply walked away? What if I cut my losses and accepted defeat? I sat there long enough to really consider it, but suddenly I was hit with a wave of realization. Defeat wouldn't just mean surrendering the app, it would mean letting my team down, abandoning the little seedlings of hope that had taken root within our vision. I finally decided enough was enough. It was time to face the reality of the situation. I gathered my team, sat them down, and explained everything. It was tough, admitting my fears in that meeting. But then something peculiar happened. Instead of judging me, they rallied around me. They brought ideas to the table, all enthusiastic, ready to pivot our strategy and redefine our vision. We spent the next week brainstorming and reworking our plan, replacing our fears with innovation. Every sleepless night became an opportunity for creativity, and every setback became a stepping stone. By the end of it, we had not just rebranded our product, but we had also attracted the attention of other investors who were eager to jump on board. I felt a strange exhilaration that made my heart race, but this time, it was fuel for a fire that I had reignited. The world I had faced began to shift as we unveiled our new approach and found ourselves with more support than we had ever imagined possible. Each day pushed us further toward our launch. It was grueling work, yet invigorating at the same time. Every late night, every cancellation, and every stressful coffee-fueled meeting somehow brought us closer together. Finally, the moment arrived. The launch day felt surreal. The energy in the office crackled like static electricity. We pressed send, and my heart raced. The moment the app hit the market, the response was even better than our wildest dreams. Reviews poured in, and people were posting about us on every social media platform you could imagine. They loved it. They believed in it the way we had when it was just an idea. There we were, bouncing back from what could have ruined us, and not just surviving but thriving. 3 months later, I found myself in the office again, surrounded by my team, sipping celebratory champagne as we reflected on what had happened. The lingering sense of doom became a distant memory, replaced by a confidence that I thought I had lost for good. We had faced a monstrous setback and emerged victorious, but the experience left scars that still reminded me of how precarious success can be. As I looked around the room, I knew this was just the beginning. Adversity had forced us to harness our potential. We had learned to embrace failure, turning it into a launch pad rather than a noose. That morning toast felt like a living testament to our journey. I raised my glass, the warmth of gratitude washing over me as I smiled at my team, to bouncing back. What felt like a death knell had transformed into soaring wings, reminding me that facing the abyss sometimes leads you to a higher peak than you ever thought you could reach. The setback had only been a moment. How we responded to it was the real story. It was in that moment that I realized setbacks are merely setups for something greater, something deeper, defining moments that shape us in ways we can't yet understand. And as the echoes of our laughter filled the room, I finally accepted that failure is simply a reroute to success. I never thought I'd find comfort in a place like that, but I suppose life works in mysterious ways, doesn't it? It all started when I took that odd job as the night custodian at an old library on the outskirts of town. You know the kind, tall, dark shelves filled with dusty tomes that no one ever bothered to check out anymore. It was the only gig I could find at the time, and I needed the money to pay off my growing student debt. That first night, after the last patron had filtered out and the front doors had closed with a creak that echoed through the empty rooms, I was left alone with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps against the worn wooden floors. I mopped the floors and organized misplaced books, but as the hours dragged on, a creeping sense of unease settled in. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows, and I could have sworn I heard whispers echoing through the aisles, but I shook it off as imagination fueled by fatigue. One night, while sweeping in the obscure history section, I found a door I'd never noticed before. It was small, almost like a child's playhouse door, set low on the wall and barely visible behind stacks of encyclopedias. I opened it hesitantly, and to my surprise, it led to a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. My heart started racing, but a strange compulsion pulled me in. With each step, the air grew cooler, and I felt a tingle run down my spine. At the bottom, I found myself in a cramped, dimly lit room cluttered with boxes and old furniture. A flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that danced around me. It felt safe, somehow. I explored the space, kicking aside dusty piles of forgotten papers and peeling journals. In one corner, I came across an ancient armchair, its fabric worn but inviting. I couldn't resist. I settled into the chair, and the moment I did, an unexpected wave of peace washed over me. It was as though the chair embraced me, wrapping me in a cocoon of warmth as the rush of my worries melted away. Most nights after that, I found myself retreating to that room. With a book in hand and the hour's weight slipping off my shoulders, I discovered a solace I hadn't known I was seeking. I read poetry and novels lost to time, often losing track of how long I'd been down there. It became a ritual, sneaking away from my janitorial duties to taste the sweet nectar of comfort in that forgotten nook. But then, something started to shift. I noticed items that I had left behind in the armchair, my coffee cup, my backpack, were shifted slightly when I returned each night. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I found a yellowed note tucked into the pages of an old book one night. Written in an elegant script, it simply said, "I see you." My stomach dropped. I thought about ghosts, about the dead who linger, filled with unfinished business. But the comfort of that chair called to me even stronger. I didn't want to leave. I returned again, and again, each time feeling the sense of being watched grow stronger. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but one night, as I sat staring at the pages of a worn-out novel, a feeling washed over me, an overwhelming sense that someone was there with me, right behind the chair. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a spirit, a dusty specter from the library's ruined past, but instead, the room was empty. Just silence and shadows. Fear took root, but it was the comfort that kept calling me back. One night, I hit my boiling point. I opened my eyes to the familiar embrace of the chair, but this time, the shadows in the room felt denser, almost suffocating. A chill crept in, raising goosebumps on my arms. "Why are you watching?" I whispered into the gloom, my heart hammering in my chest. The only answer was silence, a quiet so deep it felt menacing. But then, as if in response, the light bulb flickered above me, and a whisper drifted through the air, there, but not a voice, more like a memory echoing off walls long soaked with secrets. Welcome home. I bolted upright, heart racing, adrenaline surging. The chair, that forsaken chair, suddenly felt like a trap, not a haven. I stumbled back toward the stairs, the feeling of unseen ice piercing my back. I hurtled out of that room and up the staircase, practically tumbling into the safety of the library's main floor where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a jarring alarm. My breath came in sharp gasps, panic clouding my mind. I couldn't go back down there. I couldn't let whatever haunted that space take hold of me. Work turned into chaos as I found myself too afraid to clock in after hours. The comfort that had once enveloped me had transformed into a psychic prison. My heart ached for the tranquility I had found there, yet the whispers haunted me, persistent and unnerving. Days turned into weeks, and my resolve weakened. I could almost hear the chair calling my name, beckoning me back like a siren luring sailors to their doom. Finally, I gave in, deciding to confront whatever it was that lingered there. That night, I took a flashlight, more for the illusion of control than anything else, and marched back down the spiral staircase, each step echoing my resolve. I swung the beam around the cramped room, the light flickering uncertainly across the walls. Everything felt heavy with anticipation. I stood before the chair, feeling like a fool for being scared of an old piece of furniture, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a chair. I took a deep breath and dared to speak. "What do you want from me?" A deep silence followed, but then it materialized, a cold, tingling sensation at my back again. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Still, the air felt charged, and I felt a tug on my consciousness, a whisper wrapped in familiarity. "You belong here." The whisper came clearer now, like a soft breeze, and I trembled. There, in that library basement, I finally understood the truth. It wasn't about the chair. It was about me searching for belonging, for a place where I could feel at ease in my chaotic world. But it came with a price. The comfort I had found was tied to the memories of those who had stretched out in that armchair before me, souls trapped in paper and ink, forever seeking solace in life's shadows. At that moment, I realized I didn't belong to that place, and panic surged through me once again. I bolted up the stairs, pushing through the door and running into the cool, night air, away from the haunting of the library. I never returned to that old building after that night, despite the pull it had on my heart. I learned instead to find comfort outside, on long walks under the stars or lost in stories from other people. Because while the most unexpected place I found comfort was indeed in that old library chair, it wasn't worth the darkness that came with it. Sometimes the most unexpected comforts can also bring the most unexpected horrors, and it's a lesson I carry to this day. So if you ever find yourself drawn to the unlikely nooks of places long forgotten, tread lightly, because you never truly know what you might find waiting in the shadows. When I was a kid, I was utterly terrified of the dark. Not just the usual dread that comes with it, but a paralyzing fear that took hold of me every time the sun dipped below the horizon. My parents tried everything, bedtime stories, night lights, even leaving my door slightly ajar, but nothing worked. I would lie in bed, heart racing, convinced that something unseen lurked just beyond my bedroom door. As I grew older, I learned to hide my fear, to pretend I was brave. I told myself it was childish to be scared of shadows and creaks in the night, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was a coward, and someday, life would force me to confront what terrified me most. That day came 2 months ago, just as the leaves began to change and the nights grew longer. I had just moved into a small house on the edge of town to start my first job. It was cheaper than I expected, a bit run down, but I convinced myself that it had character. The first few nights were uneventful. I busied myself unpacking and decorating, playing music to drown out the silence. But one night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a sound, a soft whispering that seemed to echo from the dark corners of my bedroom. I sat up, my heart racing, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. My mind conjured images from horror movies I had tried to forget, of things lurking just beyond the reach of light. I told myself it was nothing, but the whispering continued, an unintelligible murmur that sent a chill down my spine. I pulled the covers over my head, breathing heavily, praying it would stop. After what felt like hours, the whispers faded, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next day at work, I confided in my coworker Lisa about what happened. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by unexplained noises, a soft tapping, the rustle of fabric, and sometimes, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. I stopped sleeping soundly, dreading the approach of night, and began to dread returning home. The tipping point came one night when I was jolted awake by a forceful knock on my bedroom door. My heart hammered in my chest as I froze, debating whether I should look. "Is anyone there?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. The knocking came again, rhythmic and deliberate. I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting me, but my cowardice bound me to the bed. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The tension lingered in the air long after the noise ceased. I made a plan to face my fear the following night. I scoured online forums, reading about ways to dispel darkness, techniques to confront fears. I figured if I confronted whatever was haunting me, I could finally reclaim my peace. That night, I filled my room with candles, the flickering light casting long shadows against the walls. I sat, cross-legged on the floor, taking deep breaths, preparing myself to face the unknown. I closed my eyes and chanted a mantra I'd found online, a mix of affirmation and courage. I am not afraid. I am strong. As I recited the words, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The temperature plummeted, and I felt a suffocating heaviness in the air. My eyes flew open, and the shadows danced menacingly around me. That's when I heard it again, the whispering, closer now, almost right next to my ear. Panic seized me, but I fought against it. "Show yourself," I shouted, surprising even myself with the strength in my voice. The room fell silent, so quiet I could hear my own heart pounding. And then, all at once, the shadows coalesced into a figure, a dark silhouette, indistinct but undeniably there. It loomed in the corner, still as a statue, and for the first time, I felt a surge of anger instead of fear. "What do you want?" I demanded, my hands clenched into fists. The figure began to dissolve, its edges blurring like smoke in the wind. But the whispering didn't stop, it grew more intense, a cacophony of hushed voices filling the space around me. I couldn't comprehend the words, but I could feel a desperation in them, as if the figure was pleading. "Why are you doing this?" I yelled, my voice trembling. A single tear escaped the corner of my eye, and I could sense a shift, a flicker of remorse in the entity's presence. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed again, warming as the whispers softened into a single, coherent word, "Help." It crashed over me like a wave of realization. This thing, this figure, wasn't here to haunt me, it sought help. "What do you need?" I asked, voice steadier now, the anger giving way to empathy. It stepped closer, the shadows retracting, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. I realized it was trapped here, bound to my home, my fear had kept it confined. My heart broke as I understood, I had spent so long pushing it away, fearing it instead of recognizing its pain. I lowered my defenses and took a breath, inviting it in. "You're not alone. You can share your story." The figure turned, revealing a face that flickered in and out of focus. Its features were sorrowful, eyes reflecting the loss and pain of a life once lived. Little by little, as I allowed it into my heart, the shadows receded, and the room filled with warmth. I could hear its faint whispers now, sharing tales of loneliness and longing, a life unfinished. Tears streamed down my face, and for the first time, I felt a connection, a shared understanding between us. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," I whispered. "You can rest now." In that moment, I knew I had faced my greatest fear. The figure faded slowly, the whispers dwindling into silence. I felt lighter, unburdened. As the darkness melted away, I smiled through my tears, realizing that fear isn't always something to fight against. Sometimes, it's a call to acknowledge the pain we carry. From that night on, I no longer feared the dark. Instead, I learned to embrace it, knowing that sometimes, within the shadows, we can find others like us, lost, afraid, desperate for connection. I may have walked into the darkness a coward, but I emerged stronger, braver, transformed by compassion and understanding. I never thought I would find myself in a situation that seemed like it was ripped straight out of a horror movie, and yet here I am, typing this out in a darkened room, my only source of light flickering from my phone screen as if the universe is mocking me. This all started about 6 months ago when I moved into a new apartment in a pretty old building. It was a classic fixer-upper, full of creaks, strange noises, and a timeless charm that could easily be overshadowed by its unsettling ambience. You know, the kind of place where you feel like there's always someone watching you, even when you're alone. I always considered myself a private person, someone who kept their feelings and fears tucked away deep inside, only allowing the carefully curated aspects of my life to see the light of day. But the moment I discovered the power of vulnerability changed everything. It was a dreary Friday evening, and I was wrapped up in my usual routine of binge-watching way too many true crime documentaries. I had my takeout on the table beside me, comfortable in my isolation after an exhausting week. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through my apartment, cutting through the hum of the TV. My heart raced as I turned the volume down. The sound came from the old storage closet at the end of the hall. I live alone, and the thought of exploring the creepy closet in an unfamiliar place sent shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably nothing. Just my imagination getting the best of me. Curiosity gnawed at me, however, and I eventually found myself standing in front of the door, the wood slightly warped from age. I grasped the handle, half expecting something to leap out at me. To my surprise, it opened easily, revealing a dark, dusty interior filled with a hodgepodge of forgotten furniture and boxes piled high. The shadows inside seemed to stretch and twist, and I shuddered. As I stepped inside, a chill swept over me, goosebumps breaking out on my skin. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on, illuminating the chaos within. That's when I saw her, a figure huddled in the corner, shrouded in shadows. I froze, feeling the earlier rush of adrenaline transform into a cold, paralyzing fear. The figure lifted her head slowly, and I saw her face, pale, gaunt, and tired. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, dark circles framing them like bruises. "Help me," she whispered, her voice cracking. My gut twisted. A voice in my head screamed to run, but I felt something, an inexplicable urge to reach out to her. "Who are you?" I stammered, instinctively taking a step back, as if distancing myself could protect me from whatever haunting sorrow cloaked her. I'm lost," she replied, her voice barely audible, weaving through the stillness of the closet like the faintest wind. "Please. I need to feel again." I blinked, confusion swirling in my thoughts. What did that even mean? But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that this wasn't just a manifestation of despair. There was something palpable, almost magnetic, drawing me closer to her pain. In that moment, something inside me cracked open, a floodgate of vulnerability pouring into the space between us. The urge to flee dissipated, replaced with a willingness to understand, an overwhelming desire to share my own burden. I stepped closer, the weight of my own emotional armor feeling heavier than ever. "I know what it's like to feel lost," I murmured, and to my surprise, the connection between us began to intensify. I'm scared. Of so many things. I don't always know how to deal with it." She nodded slowly, as if every word I spoke resonated with her. "Then you understand," she said softly. "That fear. It wraps around you like a tight noose. The darkness feels safe, but in that safety, you forget how to truly live." Those words pierced me, each syllable reverberating in my chest. I was holding on to my fear like a lifeline, convinced that if I let go, I would drown in the chaos of raw emotion. With each passing second, I found myself stripping away my fears like layers of clothing, revealing the raw flesh of my insecurities beneath. "It's hard for me, sharing myself with anyone," I admitted, my voice trembling. "What if I get hurt? What if they reject me?" She smiled gently, the faintest glimmer of understanding shining through her haunted expression. "Vulnerability is strength," she said, "not a weakness. When you allow yourself to be seen, to be known, you invite connection. You invite healing." Slowly, it dawned on me that she wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a ghost haunting my closet, she was a reflection of all the parts of myself I had neglected. In that dusty, dimly lit closet, surrounded by lost belongings and sorrow, something shifted within me. I understood then that vulnerability didn't signify defeat, it was the first step toward embracing everything I truly was. I finally saw the truth in her face, we were both lost souls, yearning for solace. Gathering my courage, I reached out, brushing my fingertips against her hand, a simple, fleeting gesture. Our connection sparked a warmth that spread through the darkness, dispelling the cold chill fear had wrapped around me for so long. In that instant, I understood the power of vulnerability. No longer was it a monster hiding in the shadows, it was the light illuminating the path toward healing. We sat there together, sharing our fears and dreams, peeling back the layers we had hidden away for far too long. Time lost all meaning, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged, both to her and to myself. Hours passed before I reluctantly pulled away, knowing I couldn't remain in the closet forever. I returned to the familiar glow of my TV, but something felt different. The heaviness in my chest had lifted. I was lighter, freer. I began sharing my journey with the world around me, friends, co-workers, even online communities. I discovered that each time I spoke my truth, I not only released my fears but also invited others to do the same. I realized there was power in vulnerability because, in opening ourselves up, we create spaces for others to find their voices, too. Today, as I type this out, I'm no longer that terrified person living in isolation. I've found strength in my vulnerability, and I promise you it won't lead you to darkness, but instead, it'll guide you toward a connection that transcends the mundane. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost or alone, remember, vulnerability is a superpower. Embrace it, wield it, and you might just uncover a world waiting to welcome you. I've never been a particularly brave person, but something happened last year that changed everything for me. It started with a routine. Every day, I would leave my job at the local library and head home to this tiny studio apartment I rented above a diner. To be honest, I thought I was content in my solitude, surrounded by stacks of books and the comforting hum of the city below. I had a few close friends, the kind who would drop by for coffee every now and then, but I mostly preferred the company of my novels, where I could lose myself for hours. But then the dreams started. At first, they were just strange, inexplicable fragments, a white room, a ticking clock, a chilling whisper calling my name. I'd wake up disoriented, heart pounding, shaking off the feeling that maybe I was losing my grip on reality. It only got worse. Soon, the dreams morphed into something darker. Each night, the same unsettling figure appeared, a shadowy version of myself, standing in the corner of that white room, just watching and waiting. Sometimes it would gesture towards me with a long, skeletal finger, as if inviting me to come closer, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the fear clawing at my throat. This persisted for weeks, until one night, I decided to confront it. I told myself that being brave for once might shatter the grip these nightmares had over me. And so I fell asleep, determined. The dream kicked in like a record scratching, and there I was, back in that stark white room. The figure was there, waiting, and I could feel its gaze burning into me. I approached it, my limbs heavy but my heart pounding with a reckless resolve. "What do you want?" I shouted, the sound echoing eerily around me. To my shock, the figure slowly lifted its finger and pointed toward the far wall where a door appeared, cracked open just slightly. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but something propelled me forward. I reached the door and pushed it open. Inside was a mirror, and I saw myself. Not as I was in real life, but a version of me that looked worn and ragged, with dark circles under my eyes. "You're stuck," the reflection said, its voice echoing in my head. "You are afraid." I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. I was stuck in my life, out of fear of stepping outside my comfort zone. That thought haunted me, and for the first time in months, I felt fire ignite in my chest. I awoke the next morning with determination. I was finally ready for change. That day, I took a walk downtown, my heart racing wildly like I was chasing something I couldn't quite see. I wasn't really sure what I was looking for, but it felt important. I ended up in a small, hipster cafe I had never noticed before. The scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air, and there was laughter, something I hadn't participated in for a long time. I ordered a drink at the counter and found a cozy seat near the window. While I sipped my coffee, I took in the world, bustling around me. And that's when I noticed her. A woman sitting at the corner table, buried in her laptop, something about her drew me in. Her hair was a mess of curls, and she wore bright yellow glasses that added a strangled pop of color to her otherwise drab outfit. I felt an unshakable urge to talk to her, to throw caution to the wind and just connect with someone. But fear held me back, the remnants of my old self clinging stubbornly like cobwebs. I glanced away, chastising myself for even considering it. But then, as if she sensed my gaze, she looked up and caught my eye. A smile spread across her face, and in that moment, everything shifted. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over. "Hi. I'm sorry to interrupt," I stammered, my voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to say I like your glasses." She looked bemused, but then she grinned wider. "Thanks." I thought I'd brighten my day a little. What happened next was a blur. We chatted, exchanged stories, and I learned her name was Sarah. We clicked instantly, laughing about the absurdity of life and sharing our favorite books. We talked about everything and nothing, and as the hours passed, it felt like I had stepped into a new world. When we finally parted ways, I was grinning from ear to ear. It dawned on me that I had taken that first leap, the one I had been too scared to take for years. Over the next few months, I kept encountering my old friend, the shadowy figure, but instead of fear, I embraced it. It was a reminder of my transformation, my commitment to change. I enrolled in a pottery class, started going to yoga, and even hosted book nights at the library. Sarah and I saw each other regularly, forging a bond that made my heart bloom with warmth. Just when I thought I had left my old life behind, everything shattered. One evening, while I was rushing back home through the usual streets, I noticed something peculiar. The atmosphere had shifted, thickening with an inexplicable energy. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. The shadows seemed deeper, the streetlights flickering ominously. As I stepped onto my building's porch, the door swung open wide, revealing my old apartment, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed through me. I stepped inside, sensing something was off. My once cozy digs felt cold, empty, like molasses dragging me down. Then, I saw it, the closet door stood ajar, and a black abyss yawned before me. From within echoed the whispers, familiar yet terrifying. "You can escape it all, simply by stepping back," the voice cooed seductively. My chronic fear clawed at my insides, threatening to pull me back into the darkness. The familiar figure from my dreams emerged, beckoning me. It all came rushing back, the time I spent locked in fear, unable to change. Sweat drenched my brow. This was it, the ultimate decision. "No," I whispered, the word felt like a declaration. "I won't go back." The figure paused, its shadow flickering like a flame. I understood in that moment that embracing change didn't mean the absence of struggles. It meant facing them head-on, staring down the demon of fear. With newfound strength, I stepped away from the closet and closed the door in defiance. That was the moment I truly knew I was ready for change, a turning point like no other. I felt the weight of the past lift, new life flooding into my veins. I rushed out of that apartment, down the stairs, until I burst into the cool night air, filled with the exhilarating thrill of possibility. I may have feared the unknown, I may have been haunted by my shadow, but now, I knew I had the power to take a different path. I contacted Sarah immediately, wanting to share my triumphant liberation from my past self. We met at the cafe again, and as I shared my experience, I felt lighter, as if shedding layers of armor I had clung to for so long. When I finished, she smiled and took my hand. "You opened the door, didn't you?" she asked softly, her eyes twinkling with warmth. And I realized, for the first time in my life, I was no longer just a solitary figure in a brightly lit world. I was ready to live, to embrace every moment of change, fear and all, and in that moment, everything felt possible. The moment I realized I was in the wrong, a lesson learned. The moment I realized I was in the wrong is one of those memories I'll never forget, a crystal clear image burned into my mind, and though it's painful, I think I needed to go through it to finally understand the kind of person I was becoming. It all started innocently enough, with me, a typical young professional who thought he had everything figured out, from his career to his relationships. I'd landed my dream job at a high-profile consulting firm right out of college, a role I'd worked insanely hard to get, pouring every ounce of my time and energy into the endless projects and presentations. My job, as exciting and intense as it was, quickly became the center of my life, to the point where I started seeing everything and everyone around me as mere background noise. Friends would invite me out, but I'd decline, using work as an excuse, or when I did show up, I'd be on my phone half the time, answering emails, giving off that busy and important vibe that I'd grown to believe defined me. My family, too, got the short end of the stick. I'd skip family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, all under the guise of having too much going on and big things in the pipeline. If I'm being honest, though, I wasn't just busy, I was disconnected, isolated even, slowly pushing everyone away while telling myself I was on the right track. At first, I didn't even notice the subtle toll this was taking on my relationships. I chalked it up to growing up, being ambitious, going after my dreams. But over time, I began to feel this emptiness creeping in, a hollow feeling I tried to ignore by throwing myself even harder into work, filling my life with numbers, presentations, and meetings. Then, one day, my best friend, Danny, called me, saying he was going through a rough patch and needed to talk. Danny and I went way back to college days, but recently, our connection had faded. When he called, I was right in the middle of preparing for a huge pitch, and I could barely hide my irritation when he asked if we could grab a drink. I didn't even let him finish before I shot him down, claiming I had too much on my plate. He paused on the line, sighed, and said he understood, even though I could hear the disappointment in his voice. Later that night, I found myself replaying that conversation, something nagging at me, a tiny voice whispering that I'd messed up, but I brushed it off, telling myself Danny would get over it. A few weeks later, my sister asked me to come home for a family dinner, something we hadn't done in ages. She even mentioned how much my parents missed me, especially Mom, who'd been asking about me nonstop. I promised I'd be there, but when the day came, I found myself stuck in the office, buried under another pile of deadlines. I didn't even call to let them know I wouldn't make it. I told myself they'd understand, that they knew how demanding my job was. But then, something happened that shattered the illusion I'd built around myself. I came into work one morning, just like any other day, to find out that a young colleague of mine had been let go, someone I'd mentored, actually, someone who looked up to me and had reminded me a lot of my younger self. I couldn't understand why they'd cut him loose. He was talented, smart, and dedicated, but apparently, the firm had been making efficiency improvements, a sterile way of saying they'd cut costs by letting people go. It hit me harder than I expected, but I buried that discomfort too, telling myself that's just the way things are in our field. That same night, as I was walking to my car, I saw Danny waiting outside the office building. He looked different, pale, tired, almost haunted. I was about to tell him I was busy, that we'd catch up another time, but he cut me off, saying we needed to talk now. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we went to a nearby coffee shop, where he sat down and finally opened up. Danny told me that his dad had been diagnosed with cancer a few months back, and he'd been struggling to cope, feeling like his whole world was crumbling. He said he tried to reach out, tried to talk to me, but every time he called, I'd been too busy, too wrapped up in my own world. He even reminded me of that phone call a few weeks back, the one I'd brushed off so easily, and as he spoke, I felt a sickening realization settle over me. I'd been so focused on myself, on my goals, on my career, that I'd failed to notice the people around me were struggling, hurting, needing me. It wasn't just Danny, either. I thought about all the missed calls from my mom, the invitations I'd ignored, the friends I'd pushed away, all because I was convinced my work was more important than anything else. Sitting there, listening to Danny pour his heart out, I felt like the worst kind of friend. I wanted to apologize, to make it right somehow, but I didn't even know where to start. That night, I went home and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, haunted by the person I'd become. The next day, I called my mom and apologized, explaining everything, and for the first time in years, I heard her cry over the phone. I took a few days off work, drove home, and spent time with my family, reconnecting, mending the wounds I'd caused. It was awkward at first, like relearning how to be close to them, but slowly, it felt like coming back to life. I met up with Danny, too, and promised him that I'd be there, no matter what. And for the first time, I started setting boundaries at work, prioritizing the people who mattered instead of treating them like an afterthought. I learned a hard lesson from that experience, a lesson about what truly matters in life, and it wasn't the job, the title, or the money. It was the people, the relationships, the connections that make life meaningful. Looking back, I'm grateful for that rude awakening, as painful as it was, because without it, I might never have realized how wrong I was. I've always struggled with self-doubt. From the moment I could remember, I had this nagging voice in my head that told me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or deserving enough. It was a crippling feeling that seeped into every corner of my life, but I had a moment one night that changed everything. It started innocently enough. I was scrolling through an old forum dedicated to personal stories, and I found this post that piqued my interest. The user described a mysterious figure who appeared in their dreams, offering cryptic advice that ultimately helped them confront their fears and insecurities. They claimed this figure, who they called the confidant, changed their life forever. Intrigued and a bit skeptical, I thought, what do I have to lose? I decided to attempt the same thing with my dreams and set my intention before going to sleep that night. I repeated to myself, I want to meet my confidant. I drifted off, unsure if this would work or if I was just wasting my time. But when I fell asleep, I found myself in a surreal landscape, one painted in shades of deep violet and teal. A fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, but I pushed through it. And that's when I saw him, tall and cloaked in shadows, yet his eyes glowed with an ethereal light. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and deep as molasses. I was terrified yet captivated. I asked, "Who are you?" He smiled, but it didn't feel entirely comforting. "I am the confidant. I can help you conquer your doubts, but only if you're willing to confront the truth within yourself." I felt a chill run through me, and immediately a flood of memories overwhelmed my mind, all the times I believed I wasn't enough, a failure, or unworthy. I wanted to pull back, to retreat into the safety of self-pity, but something compelled me to stay. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "You need to face your fears," he replied. "They're the shadows hiding your true self." With those words, the landscape shifted around me, transforming into a twisted reflection of my own failures. I was suddenly back in high school, standing outside the gym on the night of the big talent show. My heart raced as I remembered my moment of glory turning to disaster when I tripped on stage, the audience erupting in laughter, a nightmare that replayed in my mind countless times. The confidant stood beside me as the memory unfolded, nodding knowingly. "This feels like a scar, doesn't it?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "But what if I told you that this moment does not define you? You're stronger now than you were then. You have the power to rewrite this story." With a wave of his hand, the scene changed. I stood on that same stage, but this time the audience was supportive. They cheered me on as I began to sing. The shaking in my voice transformed into strength and confidence. The laughter turned into applause, and an overwhelming surge of pride filled my heart. The confidant smiled, and I felt lighter, as if a weight had lifted from my shoulders. "You see, it was just a moment. You are not defined by one performance." I awoke the next morning, breathless but intrigued. The dream lingered in my mind like an echo, urging me to embrace it. I decided to explore this newfound sense of empowerment and sign up for a local open mic night, something I'd always wanted to do but had allowed self-doubt to stop me. As days turned into weeks, I kept returning to the dream world, meeting my confidant each time, facing more fears, my terrible report cards, my failed relationships, all the things that haunted me. With each encounter, he taught me to see the strength hidden within those memories. He guided me to embrace failures as lessons instead of scars. I practiced my singing daily, performed at various events, and slowly but surely, the fear that once dictated my life started to fade. One evening, I walked onto the open mic stage, nerves sizzling in my stomach, but also a calm determination radiating through me. I looked out at the crowd, a mix of friends and strangers. I could hear the slight rustling of their chairs, feel the anticipation hanging in the air like the scent of rain. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them, I felt as if the confidant was standing next to me, reassuring me. I began to sing, letting the notes rise and fall like waves crashing on the shore. For the first time in my life, I sang without doubt, without fear, and it felt like I was pouring my soul into every lyric. The audience responded with cheers and applause that lifted me higher than any self-doubt had ever dragged me down. That night, I realized just how far I'd come, not just in conquering my fears but in discovering who I truly was beneath the layers of insecurity. In the days that followed, I began to shift my perspective, actively combating the dark thoughts that would still occasionally creep in. I found myself talking to the confidant even when I wasn't dreaming, seeking that same guidance in my waking life. I realized then that I was not alone in this journey, simply addressing the voice of self-doubt brought forth a strength I never knew I had. It felt empowering to confront that inner critic in ways I hadn't considered before. I opened up to friends about my struggles and fears. I took risks, pushed boundaries, and slowly, the confidence I had developed transformed my life. I began to push myself creatively, exploring art and writing, even attempting things I had once shied away from. The dream encounters with the confidant dwindled, and though I missed them, I understood he had shown me how to be my own guide. The last time I saw him, he simply nodded and smiled, as if to say I had graduated. The dream world faded, but the strength surged. It has been months since that pivotal moment, and I'm now in a position where I can inspire others battling self-doubt, sharing lessons I learned along the way, encouraging them to seek their own inner confidant. I realize now that everyone has their own struggles, and they, too, are capable of overcoming. I will continue to fight the good fight, learning and, sometimes, stumbling along the way. The journey to confidence is ongoing, yet I welcome every twist and turn. And sometimes, in those quieter moments late at night, I imagine the confidant standing there, proud of the progress I've made, urging me to keep going. If anyone resonates with this story, just know that you are not defined by your doubts, rather, you are shaped by how you confront them. You have the power to rewrite your story just as I did. I used to think that embracing flaws was like telling myself it was okay to fail, to be mediocre, to forgive every misstep I'd made in my life. Honestly, the concept made me sick to my stomach. Flaws were ugly little stains on the otherwise immaculate fabric of my existence, and I spent every waking hour trying to scrub them away. I was a perfectionist by every definition, meticulous, organized, set on feeding the insatiable beast of accomplishment that seemed to dictate my worth. But then, last summer, everything changed. That was when my life spiraled into something unexpected, something terrifying but strangely enlightening. I was home alone one night, plunging into a deep dive of anxiety that wrapped around me like a vice. I had just received the results of an important job interview, a position I thought I deserved. I logged onto my email, heart racing, hormones pulsing through my veins like electricity, ready to see the words "Congratulations" or "We regret to inform you." Instead, all I saw was the dreaded "Thank you for your interest," which hit me like a train. There I was, nearly 28 years old, an overachieving mess, and I couldn't keep it together for one lousy round of interviews. My mind was a battleground of self-loathing, and I felt like I was spiraling down some dark tunnel, consumed by my thoughts, weighing my worth against every person I'd ever come into contact with. In that bleak hour of despair, something strange happened. I watched the old, dusty television I rarely turned on. It flickered to life, a movie from my childhood playing, the incredibly campy horror flick Gore, Guts, and Glory. Ironically, despite its ridiculous plot and awful acting, it had been one of my favorites growing up. Suddenly, I was cast back in time. I was that innocent kid again, laughing loudly with friends who embraced their awkwardness, the way I had once done. The image of my carefree self cracked open something within me, and before I knew it, I was scrolling through old photos, memories flooding my system. I stumbled upon a picture of myself at the beach in a vibrant, mismatched bikini, at least 15 pounds heavier than I am now, sunburnt and grinning from ear to ear, clutching a watermelon like it was my prized possession. The smile on my face was wonderful, an overwhelming burst of joy, of flaws embraced. It hit me then. That moment had been pure and untainted. That was someone who didn't know perfection and didn't care, who relished in the sun's rays and her friends' laughter. I wanted that back. I wanted to feel that freedom again. So, I did something weird. I plunged into the most outrageous journey of self-discovery I could think of. I started going to wrestling classes. Yes, wrestling, tiny town amateur wrestling where I would put myself out there, physically and emotionally. The first day, I walked in trembling, clutching my water bottle like a safety blanket, surrounded by these hulking individuals, people who seemed to know their bodies, their roles, and their ultimate powers. My heart raced as I reluctantly joined the class, but instead of being judged, I was met with warmth and encouragement. I fell spectacularly during my first match, some guy easily tossing me aside. Laughter filled the air, my face burned a deep crimson, but the sound was euphoric. Instead of shame washing over me, I found I couldn't stop laughing either. They cheered me on, not for my skill, but for my audacity to even try. I signed up for each subsequent class, threw myself into wrestling, and began to embrace the discomfort of failure. Each tumble, each fall led to more laughter, more ridiculous moments shared. The bonds I formed with strangers transformed into friendships, scrapes and bruises became symbols of pride, the wrestlers embracing their own flaws, their unique quirks, everything that made them strange and marvelous. I also began to realize how oddly beautiful it was to share these experiences. After several weeks of training, I was invited to join an exhibition event, a night filled with mismatched styles, eccentric characters, and theatrical personas. I was terrified, yet thrilled, to be part of an authentic wrestling experience. As the lights dimmed and a fog rolled over the ring, I stepped inside adorned with a costume I had crafted, ridiculously nonsensical, in homage to the childhood dream I had long neglected. The crowd roared as I went up against competitors who fought with tenacity, who delved into theatrical storytelling while embracing every flaw they had. I was greeted with whoops and hollers, immersed in fluidity, becoming part of something larger than myself, transcending the confines of judgment I had placed upon myself all those years. Whether in sport or in social life, I began to realize that confidence was not built on perfection but constructed from shared flaws, from small triumphs in the face of imperfection. I learned to wear my flaws as a badge of honor and a testament to the incredible resilience that emerged from finally letting go, from accepting what I could not change, my heavy laugh, my stumbling walk, every time I mispronounced a word. I learned how to share openly about my insecurities, watching others beam with relief as we unveiled our true selves one conversation at a time. I've since formed meaningful relationships. Their distortions in life, glitches, imperfections woven into a narrative uniquely theirs, were now things I sought out, cherished, and celebrated. I forged new friendships solidified by a collective understanding that being human meant embracing flaws rather than detesting them. It's been a journey that led to newfound joy. The wrestling, its absurdity and beauty, taught me to cherish flaws. Now, 35 pounds lighter but more importantly, enveloped with love for every little quirk that once made me feel isolated, I stand firm, my heart lighter than it had ever been. No longer do I feel inadequate. Each time I face a setback, I hear the laughter of my wrestling friends, a reminder that in flaws lies freedom, sculpting a life stitched together with threads of imperfection and laughter. It's a wild ride, embracing these flaws, but it is a ride well worth the taking. So here's my plea to you, join me. Let go of that oppressive notion of perfection, embrace your flaws, love the chaos, and laugh with abandon. Life is too short for anything less. When I discovered my passion, a journey of self-discovery. I didn't expect my life to change at a random open mic night, but that's exactly what happened. I was dragged there by my friend Sarah, who swore it was the best way to shake off my so-called funk. My funk, as she called it, was the rut I'd been stuck in since graduating college, with a degree I didn't care about and a job I hated even more. That night, the small cafe was packed with people, a mix of regulars and first-timers like us, all crammed into mismatched chairs around tiny tables. The stage was just a wooden platform lit by a single spotlight, and the air smelled of coffee and cinnamon. I wasn't in the mood for poetry or amateur guitar players, but Sarah was persistent, so I sipped my latte and kept my eyes on the door, fantasizing about a quick escape. Then, the host announced a spoken-word artist named Max. He was a lanky guy with wild hair and a nervous smile, clutching a crumpled notebook as he walked up to the microphone. I rolled my eyes, expecting something pretentious or overly dramatic, but within seconds of him starting, I was hooked. Max spoke about ordinary things, morning commutes, grocery shopping, awkward conversations, but the way he turned these mundane experiences into something profound left me speechless. He painted pictures with his words, weaving humor and heartbreak in a way that felt personal and universal all at once. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, a mix of awe and envy. When Max finished, the applause was thunderous, and I found myself clapping louder than anyone else. I couldn't stop thinking about his performance for days. I started Googling spoken-word videos, watching everything I could find. Each poem I listened to felt like a new layer of my soul was being peeled back. I remembered how, as a kid, I used to scribble little stories and poems in a notebook I kept hidden under my bed. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost that spark, burying it under practicality and the need to grow up. Inspired, I dug through old boxes in my closet until I found that notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. Reading my childhood poems felt like reconnecting with a forgotten part of myself. They were rough, full of clichés and clumsy rhymes, but they were mine. I decided to try writing again, not for anyone else, but for me. At first, it was awkward. The words felt stiff, like I was trying too hard, but I kept at it. Every lunch break at work, I'd sit in the corner of the cafeteria with a notebook, scribbling whatever came to mind. Slowly, the stiffness faded, and the words began to flow. I wrote about everything, my frustrations, my dreams, the little moments that made up my days. It was like a dam had burst, and I couldn't stop. After weeks of writing in secret, Sarah found one of my poems on the coffee table and begged me to read it aloud. I was mortified, but her enthusiasm was contagious. She convinced me to sign up for the same open mic night we'd gone to, and I spent the next 2 weeks rehearsing my poem in front of the mirror until I could recite it without stumbling. When the night came, I was a nervous wreck. My palms were sweaty, and my heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Sarah dragged me to the cafe, promising it would be fun, but all I could think about was how much I wanted to run. My name was called, and I walked up to the stage on trembling legs. The spotlight was blinding, and I could barely see the audience. I gripped the microphone, my voice shaking as I began. But then, something amazing happened. As I spoke, the fear melted away. The words felt alive, each one pulling me deeper into the moment. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. I'd never felt anything like it, the rush of sharing something so personal and having it resonate with others. That night, Max approached me and told me he loved my poem. We talked for hours, and he invited me to join a local writing group he was part of. I started going to their weekly meetings, where I met people who shared my passion for words. They became my support system, pushing me to take risks and refine my craft. Over the next year, I performed at more open mic nights, entered poetry slams, and even published a few pieces in local magazines. My job was still soul-crushing, but writing gave me a reason to get through the day. Eventually, I decided to take a leap of faith. I quit my job and started freelancing, writing copy for small businesses during the day and working on my poetry at night. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, I felt like I was living authentically. My journey wasn't just about discovering my passion, it was about rediscovering myself. Writing taught me to see the beauty in the everyday, to find meaning in the chaos of life. And it all started with one night, one poem, and the courage to chase a spark that had been buried for too long. When I witnessed an act of kindness, a heartwarming story. It was a cold, bleak afternoon when I witnessed something that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a moment of kindness that still feels unreal, even as I sit here reflecting on it. I was walking home from work, the wind biting at my skin as I hunched into my coat, trying to shield myself from the chill. It had been a tough week. I had been under a lot of stress at work, juggling more tasks than usual, and I hadn't had much time for myself. The streets were busy as usual, with people rushing by, each of them lost in their own little world. I was used to the anonymity of the city, where you could walk down the street and hardly anyone would make eye contact, let alone speak to you. As I walked past a small park, I saw a woman sitting on a bench, hunched over, her face buried in her hands. At first, I thought nothing of it, maybe she was just having a bad day, maybe she was tired. But as I got closer, I noticed that her clothes were tattered and worn, her shoes almost falling apart. She looked like she hadn't had a proper meal in days. There was something in the way she sat, her shoulders slumped, that made my heart ache. I slowed my pace, unsure of what to do. I was just about to turn away when I saw a man approach her. He wasn't wearing anything particularly special, just a regular jacket and jeans, but there was something about him that drew my attention. He stopped a few feet away from the woman, and for a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. I could tell the woman was startled, like she didn't expect anyone to approach her. I felt a strange wave of tension in the air. The man then knelt down in front of her, gently touching her arm. The woman flinched at first, like she was afraid he was going to harm her, but then she looked up at him. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me everything. The man's posture was calm, reassuring. He didn't look at her with pity or judgment, he looked at her with empathy, like he saw her as a fellow human being, not someone to be ignored or avoided. After a moment, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. He handed it to the woman, who looked at it in confusion, unsure of what to make of the gesture. But when she opened the envelope, her eyes widened in surprise. Inside was a small amount of cash, enough to buy a meal or maybe even a couple of days' worth of groceries. She looked up at the man, her face a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She stammered something, but I couldn't make out the words. The man simply nodded, giving her a warm, understanding smile. Then, without saying anything else, he stood up and began to walk away. The woman watched him go, still holding the envelope in her hands, almost as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, unsure of how to process what I had just witnessed. It was such a simple act, yet so profound. He hadn't given her anything extravagant, just a small amount of money, but it was the way he did it that stuck with me. It wasn't about the money, it was about the human connection, the way he saw her and chose to help her without hesitation. It was a moment that reminded me that kindness still exists in this world, even in places where we least expect it. I continued on my way home, my mind racing with a mixture of awe and confusion. I didn't know why the act had impacted me so much. Maybe it was because I was so used to the cold, detached world around me, where everyone kept to themselves and the hustle of daily life made it easy to ignore the struggles of others. Maybe it was because I had been feeling so disconnected lately, too caught up in my own problems to notice what was happening around me. But witnessing that moment changed something in me. I started to pay more attention to the people around me, the small gestures of kindness that go unnoticed, the way a smile from a stranger can brighten your day, the way a simple "how are you?" can make someone feel seen. It made me realize how easy it is to make a difference, even in small ways. I don't know who that man was or what led him to help that woman, but I'll never forget the way he treated her. It reminded me that kindness doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes, it's just about being there for someone, showing them that they matter. A few days later, I found myself walking through that same park again, and to my surprise, I saw the woman sitting on the bench again. But this time, she was smiling. She wasn't hunched over, her hands weren't covering her face. She looked like she had more energy, more life in her. She saw me walking by, and for the first time, she didn't look down or avoid eye contact. She gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed. It wasn't just the money that had made a difference. It was the kindness, the connection. The belief that someone cared enough to help her, to treat her with dignity. It was a reminder that we're all just people, trying to make it through this world the best we can. The act of kindness I witnessed that day wasn't some life-altering moment. It wasn't some earth-shattering revelation. But it was exactly what I needed to see at that point in my life, a reminder that even in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there are still people who choose to make it warmer. And for that, I will always be grateful.